The morning started the way most mornings did in Blackthorn Ridge, with noise. Wagons rattling over the hard-packed dirt of Main Street, women calling to each other from across fences, the blacksmith's hammer already going before the sun had properly cleared the ridgeline to the east. It was a Monday in late October, and there was a bite in the air that made horses restless and made men pull their coats tighter without admitting they were cold. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, and a wind kept stripping the leaves loose in small, spiraling gusts. Mara Whitlock noticed none of it. She was standing in front of a cracked piece of mirror glass propped against the wall of the room she rented above Hensley's dry goods store, and she was doing what she had been doing for the better part of 20 minutes, looking at her own face and trying to decide if it mattered. It was not, by the standards of Blackthorn Ridge, a remarkable face. Her nose had a slight hook to it that her mother had always said made her look like an old woman before her time. Her jaw was a little too square, her brows a little too heavy, and she had a scar along the left side of her chin from the time she'd fallen from a fence post at 7 years old and split herself open on a rock. Her eyes were a plain sort of brown, not warm brown, not honey brown, just brown, like creek mud after rain. She was 24 years old, and she had been told, in one way or another, that she was difficult to look at for most of those years. She pulled her dark hair back and pinned it with 3 pins she'd borrowed from Mrs. Hensley downstairs. She owned one dress that was presentable enough for a public occasion, a gray wool thing with white buttons down the front and a hem that sat just above her boot tops. She put it on. She smoothed it with her palms. She looked at herself in the mirror one more time, and then she stopped looking because it wasn't doing her any good. Downstairs, she could already hear voices out on the street. Selection Day came once a year in Blackthorn Ridge, and it drew a crowd the way a hanging did. Not because people were cruel, necessarily, but because they had nothing better to do, and cruelty dressed up as tradition was easier to recognize. The town of Blackthorn Ridge had been built in the hard years after the war, when men with nothing left pushed west and found a valley between 2 ridge lines where a creek ran clean and the soil wasn't entirely useless. They built it fast and they built it rough, and 40 years later it still had the look of something that hadn't quite decided whether it was going to stay or give up. 230 people, 1 church, 2 saloons, a school that doubled as a meeting hall, a sheriff who had held his position for 12 years and believed, sincerely and without apology, that order required rules and rules required enforcement. Sheriff Dale Hargrove was the one who had invented Selection Day. The idea wasn't entirely without logic, he would tell you, if you asked. The town had a surplus of unmarried men, ranch hands, miners, drifters who'd put down roots, and a shortage of domestic stability. Too many men living without anyone to account to meant too many fights, too much drinking, too much trouble that ended up on his doorstep. Marriage, in his view, was a civic good. Selection Day was a mechanism for producing it. What it actually produced, most years, was an afternoon of theater. The unmarried women of the town would gather in the square. The unmarried men would choose. There was no coercion, technically. A man could decline to choose, and a woman could refuse to go with a man who chose her. But in a town this size, in a year this late, with winter coming on and the social pressure of 230 neighbors pressing down on you from all sides, the word technically did a lot of work. Mara had stood in the square for 4 selection days now. She had not been chosen on any of them. The first year she'd told herself it didn't matter. The second year she'd cried privately, in her room, and then been angry at herself for crying. The third year, she'd gone numb in a way that was almost worse than the crying. This year she was going because not going was worse. Not going meant people talked about you differently. Not going meant you'd given up, and whatever she was, Mara Whitlock had not given up. She picked up her coat from the hook on the door and went downstairs. Mrs. Hensley was in the store, rearranging tins on a shelf with the focused energy of a woman who needed something to do with her hands. She was 63 years old, round-faced, with silver hair she kept in a braid she wrapped twice around her head. She had rented Mara the room for 3 years, and in that time had offered opinions on almost every subject, freely and without being asked. "You're going, then," she said, without turning around. "I'm going," Mara said. "You don't have to." "I know." Mrs. Hensley set a tin of boot black on the shelf with more force than strictly necessary. "I've said what I think about the whole business. Dale Hargrove and his ideas about "you have said what you think," Mara agreed, quite a few times. The old woman turned and looked at her. Her eyes went over the gray dress, the pinned hair, the set of Mara's jaw. Something moved in her expression. Not pity, exactly. Something that was trying not to be pity. "You look fine," she said. Mara almost smiled. "You're a bad liar, Mrs. Hensley." "I'm not lying. Fine is fine. I know what I look like." She adjusted her coat collar. "I've had a long time to get used to it." She went out before the old woman could say anything else. Yeah. The square was already filling up. It was not a large square, more of a wide spot in the main street, really, with the sheriff's office on one end and the feed store on the other, and a dead oak tree in the middle that no one had ever gotten around to cutting down. Someone had strung a rope between the oak and a hitching post, and a few paper lanterns had been tied to it, though they looked more funereal than festive in the gray morning light. Women were gathering near the rope. There were 11 of them this year. Mara counted automatically, because counting gave her something to do besides look at the faces around her. There was Clara Briggs, who was 19 and had yellow hair and a laugh that carried 3 blocks. There was Doris Sutton's youngest girl, who was maybe 17 and had been brought by her mother, who stood nearby with a proprietary expression. There was Agnes Calm, who was 30 and had been passed over the previous 2 years, and who was, Mara thought, bracing herself in exactly the same way Mara was. There were others, most of them younger, most of them with the bright, careful look of people who expected something good to happen to them. And then there was Mara. She took her place near the end of the row, close to the oak tree, which was where she always stood. You could put your hand on the bark if things got bad. It helped a little to have something solid to hold on to. The men arrived in ones and twos, drifting in from the saloon and the livery and the various corners of town where men spent their Monday mornings. There were perhaps 30 of them, which meant most would leave without choosing anyone, and that was fine. The ones who chose were the ones who'd been thinking about it, who'd talked it over or made up their minds in advance. Mara recognized faces. Tom Briggs, Clara's brother, who would never choose Clara obviously, but who was here because attendance was expected. The Garfield brothers, both of them too young and too stupid for anyone's good. Old Pete Nevers, who was 55 if he was a day, and who came every year without choosing and without anyone choosing to make a fuss about it. Deputy Roy Strand, who had a weak chin and a habit of laughing at things that weren't funny. And at the far edge of the gathering, arriving last and alone, Colt Mercer. Mara noticed him the way you notice weather changing. Not a conscious observation so much as a shift in the atmosphere. Several people near her noticed him too. There was a small murmur, a turning of heads. Colt Mercer was not easy to ignore. He was tall, not unusually so, but tall in a way that seemed deliberate, like every inch of him had earned its right to be there. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were visibly calloused, even from across the square. His face was angular and weathered in the way that sun and wind and years of outdoor work produced, with lines around his eyes that weren't entirely from squinting. He wore a dark coat that had seen better days and boots that had seen worse. He had a jaw that looked like it had been put together from spare parts and had turned out better than intended. He had been ranching in the hills 6 miles north of town for 11 years. He came to Blackthorn Ridge when he needed supplies and left as soon as he had them. He had not participated in a single selection day in all that time, and the general understanding was that he never would. Mara looked at him for 1 second, then looked away. Bautika. Sheriff Hargrove came out of his office at 9:30, wearing his good hat and his official expression. He was a stocky man with a gray mustache, and the kind of confidence that came from not having been wrong about anything. In so long, he'd forgotten what being wrong felt like. He stood in front of the gathered town and gave the same speech he gave every year, about community and stability and the importance of building something lasting. He used the word foundation 3 times. He used the word prosperity twice. He said nothing funny, and no one laughed. He concluded by informing the men that they had until noon to make their selections, and that he expected the town to conduct itself with dignity. The words dignity and selection day had always seemed to Mara to have a difficult relationship. The choosing began. Tom Briggs chose Doris Sutton's youngest girl, who blushed and took his arm and looked genuinely pleased. The Garfield boys chose women who accepted with expressions ranging from resignation to mild optimism. 3 other men made selections, quick, practical, without much ceremony. Clara Briggs was chosen by a miner named Eddard, who had a good reputation and a steady income, and who Clara clearly liked because her whole face changed when he came toward her. One by one, the row thinned. Agnes Colm was chosen. She would be glad of that, Mara thought, and then the girl next to Agnes, and then the girl next to her. The square was getting louder. People who hadn't come to watch the choosing had drifted over from the saloon and the storefronts, drawn by the noise and the social gravity of the thing. Someone in the crowd laughed at something. Deputy Strand said something to the man next to him, and they both looked in Mara's direction, and she felt the familiar sensation of wanting to put her back against something solid so they couldn't look at her from behind as well. She kept her hand on the bark of the dead oak. The row was down to 4 women now. Herself and 3 others she didn't know well. The choosing was slowing. The men who'd intended to choose had mostly done so. The remaining ones were milling without purpose, waiting for noon, for permission to leave. Someone in the crowd said, loudly enough to carry, "Who's left to get old Scarface?" She didn't react. She had stopped reacting to that particular name 2 years ago. The trick was to look at a fixed point somewhere above the horizon and let the words slide off the surface of you, the way water slides off stone. It didn't always work, but it worked better than the alternative, which was letting them see that it landed. "Look at her standing there," a woman's voice said close by. "Every year. Doesn't she have any pride?" Mara moved her gaze to the far ridgeline, where the cottonwoods made a yellow smear against the gray sky. And then something happened that had never happened before. Sheriff Hargrove's voice cut through the crowd noise. "Mercer!" It was not a question. It was the sound of a man who had been building to something. The crowd quieted in the particular way that crowds quiet when they sense something interesting is about to occur. Mara kept looking at the ridgeline, but she was listening. "I've got no obligation to participate in this," Colt Mercer said. His voice was low and even, not raised, but it carried. "I've said that before, and I'm saying it again. You're a member of this community, whether you act like it or not, and this community has expectations. Your expectations," Colt said. "The town's expectations. Respectable men build families. That's how towns survive. Towns survive because people work. I work." There was a ripple through the crowd. Not quite amusement, not quite tension, something between the two. "Mercer." Hargrove's voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted to make clear he was done negotiating. "You will participate, or I will have a conversation with the county commissioner about the water rights dispute on your northern pasture that's been sitting on my desk for 3 months. A silence. Mara was looking at the ridgeline, but she felt the silence. She heard the slow sound of boots on packed dirt, moving. She heard the crowd shift, the rustle and murmur of 200 people collectively holding their breath. She heard someone whisper something and someone else laugh, and then the laughter cut off. She turned her head. Colt Mercer was walking toward her. Not toward the row of women in general. Not toward the end of the square where 3 other women still stood unclaimed. Toward her. Toward Mara, specifically. She could see it in the direction of his gaze, which was fixed on a point that, as he closed the distance, she realized with a slow, cold lurch in her chest was her face. He stopped in front of her. He was closer than she'd expected. She could see the actual color of his eyes, a gray-green, the color of sage in autumn, and the slight asymmetry of his face, a scar of his own across the bridge of his nose, broken once and healed slightly crooked. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual because she was generally good at reading expressions that told her bad news was coming. "Your name's Mara," he said. Not a question. She held herself very still. "Yes." "Colt Mercer." He didn't extend his hand, neither did she. "I've seen you in the Hensley store a few times. You work?" "I keep the accounts for the dry goods. I help at the school some mornings." She didn't know why she was answering him, except that he'd asked plainly and she'd responded to plainness without thinking about it. He nodded once. Not a nod of approval or disapproval, more like a nod of confirmation, the way you nod when something turns out to be what you expected. "I need someone who can keep accounts," he said. "The ranch books are a mess." Behind him, she could hear the crowd. She could hear the laughter beginning, not from one person, but from several. The kind of laughter that spreads because other people are laughing, not because anything is funny. She could hear someone saying something she couldn't quite make out. and then a sharper voice that she recognized as the deputy's, making a joke that got a bigger laugh. She looked at Colt Mercer's face. He wasn't laughing. He didn't appear to be aware of the laughter, or if he was, he'd decided it was beneath his attention. He was still looking at her with that unreadable expression and waiting, with obvious patience, for her to respond. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I know that." "They're laughing at you. At this." She wasn't going to say at me. She had some pride left. "Let them," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the angle, the joke inside the kindness, the cruelty dressed up as something else. She'd gotten very good, over 24 years, at finding the angle in things that looked decent on the surface. But she couldn't find it here. She could see no pity in his face, no performance, no awareness of the crowd at all except as a mild annoyance he'd already decided to ignore. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take your time." He didn't move. She took about 10 seconds. Then she said, "All right." He nodded again. He held out his arm. Not dramatically, not with any particular feeling, just the way you'd offer an arm to someone who had to walk somewhere with you. She put her hand on it. The laughter got louder as they walked. She heard it behind her and on both sides, and she kept her eyes forward and her hand on Colt Mercer's arm. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "This is the last time I walk through that sound." She didn't know, then, if that was true. She only knew she was going to try to make it true. They collected her things from the room above Hensley's store. It took less than an hour, which said something about how lightly she'd always lived in this town. Like someone who'd never fully unpacked, never fully committed to the idea that this was where she was going to be. Mrs. Hensley stood in the doorway of the store and watched Mara come down the stairs with a canvas bag over each shoulder and a crate of books tucked under one arm. "You're sure about this?" the old woman said. "No," Mara said honestly, "but I'm going." Mrs. Hensley made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite disapproval. "The man's decent enough, from what I know of him, keeps to himself, pays his accounts." She paused. "Doesn't say much." "I can work with that," Mara said. "Your room will be here if you need it." Mara put down the crate and hugged her. It surprised them both. Mrs. Hensley went stiff for a second and then patted Mara's back 3 times, firmly, the way you'd pat a horse you were trying to calm. "Off with you then," the old woman said when Mara stepped back. Her voice was rougher than it had been. Colt's wagon was out front. He loaded her bags without comment and helped her up to the seat. He'd said about 30 words to her so far, which she was beginning to think might be his average. They drove out of town on the North Road, and Mara did not look back. She heard from behind her a voice she recognized as belonging to Ida Roark, the woman who'd been calling her old Scarface since they were children, who'd made it a kind of hobby, calling something after the wagon. She didn't catch the words, and she didn't ask anyone to repeat them. The wagon wheels ground against the road. The cottonwoods along the creek thinned out. The town shrank behind her into a cluster of brown buildings against the yellow and gray of the hills. Colt drove without speaking for about 2 miles. He handled the horses with the easy, unselfconscious competence of someone who'd been doing it all his life. He didn't hold the reins too tight. He sat with a kind of settled weight that made Mara think of a man who had made his peace with taking up space. She sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead. Finally, she said, "I want to be clear about something." He looked at her sideways. "All right. I don't have romantic ideas about this. I don't know you. You don't know me. I'll keep your books and help with whatever work I can manage, and in exchange I'll have a roof and some distance from that town, and that suits me fine." She said it quickly, because if she didn't say it fast, she wouldn't say it at all. "I just think it's better if we both understand what this is." He was quiet for a moment. "That suits me fine too," he said. She nodded. She looked at the road. "The books really are a mess," as he added. "I noticed you mentioned that twice." "It's twice as bad as you're imagining." She looked at him. The corner of his mouth had moved slightly. Not a smile exactly. More like the shadow a smile would leave if it passed through quickly on its way somewhere else. She looked away. The road unwound ahead of them, gray-brown and straight, cutting through the dry grass toward the ridge where his ranch sat 6 miles north of a town she'd been waiting to leave for most of her life. She flexed her fingers in her lap and breathed. This was not the life she'd imagined. But then, she'd stopped imagining lives a few years back, because imagining things that weren't coming made the actual days harder to get through. What she had right now was this: a wagon, a road, a man who didn't appear to think she was a joke, and 6 miles of distance between herself and every voice that had told her she wasn't worth looking at. She would take it. The ranch appeared at the top of a long slope, a main house, low and wide, built from timber that had weathered to the color of old saddle leather. A barn behind it, larger than the house, its doors standing open. A corral with 4 horses in it, a roan and 3 bays, who lifted their heads and watched the approaching wagon with mild interest. A windmill near the well, turning slowly. A kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter, rows of dark earth under a sky that had gone the color of old pewter. It was not beautiful, exactly, but it was solid. Everything about it suggested permanence, not the kind that came from pretending things were fine, but the kind that came from actually fixing things when they broke. Mara looked at it and felt something she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it as the absence of dread, which was so unusual she'd briefly mistaken it for something else. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Mostly. Hired help for the barn framing." He pulled the team to a stop near the house. "There's a room off the kitchen. It's small. Previous hand used it." He paused. "It has a door that locks." She looked at him. He looked at the barn. "I'm saying you can have privacy. I'm not... That's not a complicated statement." "I understand," she said. "Some people would make it complicated." "I'm not some people." Another one of those almost smiles. "I'm starting to think that's true." He climbed down from the wagon and began unhitching the horses. Mara climbed down on her own side. She'd always been capable of climbing down from things without assistance, and she saw no reason to change that now, and stood in the yard and looked at the house. From somewhere inside, she could smell old wood and dust and the faint ghost of a fire that had been burning earlier in the day and was now banked. Somewhere down the slope, a calf was making noise. She picked up her bags. "The door's open," Colt said without looking up from the harness buckle he was working on. "Kitchen's on the left. Room's past that." She went inside. Well, the kitchen was low-ceilinged and plain, with a cast-iron stove against one wall and a table with 2 chairs pushed up to it. There was a shelf of provisions that needed reorganizing, a window over the dry sink that looked out over the yard, and on the table, as promised, a pile of papers and ledger books that constituted the ranch accounts. She put her bags down in the doorway of the small room, which was, in fact, small, but had a cot and a nail for her coat and a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which she had always preferred, and came back to the table. She sat down. She pulled the top ledger toward her and opened it. It was indeed a mess. 3 different hands had made entries at various points, in pencil and ink both, with figures crossed out and rewritten, and in some cases simply abandoned mid-column. The most recent entries were Colt's own writing. She could tell because it was the most deliberate, each letter formed with the careful effort of someone who'd taught himself to write as an adult, and never quite trusted that he was doing it right. The numbers were accurate enough. She could see that much. He wasn't careless, just disorganized. But the organization itself was in a state that would have made an accountant weep. She turned to the first page. This she could fix. She didn't have much. Never had. But she had always been good at finding the logic inside disorder, at seeing how things should connect when they'd gotten tangled. It was maybe the most useful thing about her, practically speaking, and it wasn't a thing that had anything to do with what she looked like. She found a pencil in her coat pocket and got to work. Outside, she could hear the horses being led to the corral, the sound of Colt's boots on the hard ground, the windmill's slow turning. Inside, the stove ticked with the last of its heat. She bent over the ledger. She breathed. The accounts made sense. The world outside this room made its usual kind of sense. People were cruel, expectations were arbitrary, and belonging somewhere was something that happened to other people, mostly. But this, numbers in columns, errors to be found and corrected, order recoverable from chaos, this she understood. She worked until the light through the east window had shifted from gray to something approaching gold, and she didn't notice until Colt knocked on the doorframe of the kitchen and asked, without any particular warmth but without coldness either, whether she ate supper. "Yes," she said, looking up from the ledger. "I eat supper." "Then come on," he said, and went to the stove. She closed the ledger. She had found the first error in the accounts, a transposed figure from the spring cattle sale that had compounded itself across 6 months of entries and made the balance look worse than it was. The actual situation, she had calculated, was better by $11.30 than Colt believed it to be. She would tell him over supper. It was a small thing. But she had learned in 24 years of small things being the only things available to her that small things had a way of adding up. She ate. He ate. He made the coffee strong and didn't apologize for it. She drank it without complaint because she'd always liked strong coffee and had never been offered it by someone who wasn't going to comment on the fact that they were offering her something. She told him about the $11.30. He looked at her across the table for a moment. Then he said, "You found that in 4 hours?" 3.5. The last man I hired to look at those books spent a week and said everything balanced. Everything balanced incorrectly, she said. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. He refilled his coffee. He refilled hers without asking. What else? He said. The spring accounts go back and recalculate from April. There are probably 2 or 3 other compounded errors. I'll find them. Tomorrow? If you have more paper. I have paper. He drank his coffee. You said you help at the school. 3 mornings a week. I read with the younger children. She paused. I won't be doing that anymore. She hadn't thought about it until she said it. It landed somewhere inside her with a small, quiet weight. Not regret exactly, but the recognition of a thing she was leaving behind. The children had not cared what she looked like. They had only cared whether she read the stories in the right voices. There's a school in Millhaven, he said, 8 miles east, if you wanted to do something like that. She looked at him. He was looking at his cup. You don't have to offer me things, she said. I know. He looked up. I'm not offering. I'm saying there's a school there. What you do with that information is your business. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. All right, he said. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved through the spaces between the buildings, making the low, lonely sound that wind makes in places where there aren't enough walls to break it. The kitchen was warm. The stove had been built up again at some point when she hadn't been paying attention. The lamp on the table cast a circle of yellow light that didn't reach the corners of the room. This was, Mara thought, the strangest day of her life. Not the worst. There had been worse several times over, but the strangest. The day had begun with her standing in a square in that town, waiting to be looked at and not chosen, and it was ending here, in a kitchen that was not hers but not hostile, sharing a table with a man who spoke like someone measuring words against a finite supply. She didn't know what to make of it yet. She was beginning to think she didn't need to, not tonight. I'll wash the dishes, she said. I'll do it, he said. I'm capable. I know you're capable. I do the dishes. It's a habit. He stood and collected the plates. You can go over those accounts again if you want, or you can sleep. You've had a long day. She sat at the table for another moment after he'd turned to the dry sink. She looked at the ledger on the far end of the table, closed now, but with a slip of paper marking her place. She looked at the back of Colt Mercer's head, the way his hair needed cutting, the way he stood at the sink with the same settled weight he'd had on the wagon seat, not performing anything, just doing the thing he was doing. She went to the room off the kitchen. She changed out of the gray dress and hung it on the nail. She sat on the edge of the cot and took down her hair and ran her fingers through it and felt the ache in her shoulders from the tension she'd been carrying all day begin, slowly and without fanfare, to loosen. The window faced east. Tomorrow it would bring light. She lay down. Outside, she could hear him finishing the dishes, and then the sound of the lamp being turned down, and then his boots moving across the floor toward wherever he slept, and then nothing except the wind and the windmill and the occasional far-off complaint of one of the horses in the corral. She had left Blackthorn Ridge. She had made it this far. Whatever came next, and she was not so foolish as to think it would be easy or simple or without its own particular hardships. She had made it this far. It was enough for tonight. She closed her eyes. She woke before the sun. It was a habit built from years of early mornings at the dry goods store, where Mrs. Hensley believed that the day's work should begin before the day itself had fully committed to arriving. Mara lay still for a moment in the dark of the small room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the place, cataloging them the way she cataloged everything. methodically, without rushing to conclusions. The windmill turning, a horse shifting its weight in the corral. The particular silence of a house where one person lived alone and had gotten used to it. She dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen. The stove had gone cold overnight. She found the wood box next to it, 3/4 full, split into pieces of a manageable size, and she laid a fire the way Mrs. Hensley had taught her. Tinder first, small pieces crossed over it. The larger logs held back until the smaller ones were going. It took 2 matches. She considered that acceptable. She put the coffee on and sat at the table and opened the ledger. By the time Colt appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair uncombed, his shirt buttoned only halfway, the look of a man who had not yet made his peace with being awake, she had found a second compounded error and was working on confirming a third. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. Then he looked at the stove, where the coffee was ready, then back at her. "You made the fire," he said. "The room was cold. I would have made it. You were asleep." She didn't look up from the ledger. "The coffee's done." He stood there for another moment in the way of a man recalibrating something. Then he went to the stove and poured 2 cups and set one beside her elbow without a word. "Second errors in the summer feed accounts," she said. "Someone, probably you, recorded a delivery twice. You paid for it once, but the ledger shows double the expense. That's another $6 on the wrong side." He sat down across from her with his coffee. He hadn't buttoned the rest of his shirt. He looked at her over the rim of his cup with an expression that was, she was beginning to learn, his version of surprised. $6, he said. "And 40 cents. The 40 cents is from a rounding error in July." She closed the ledger. "Your books aren't as bad as you said. They're disorganized, but the errors are mostly mechanical. You weren't careless, you just didn't have a system." "What kind of system?" "I'll show you later." She drank her coffee. It was strong again. She was already deciding she liked this about him. "What time do the ranch hands come?" "Don't have any. Just me." She looked at him. "You run this place alone?" "Mostly." He set down his cup. "Had a hand last spring. He left when his brother got sick. Before that, a couple of men helped with the calving season." He shrugged, a small, economical movement, like he'd learned to keep his shrugs from taking up too much space. "I manage." She looked around this kitchen, at the shelf of provisions that hadn't been properly organized, at the window glass that needed cleaning, at the list of unfinished things that accumulated in any space where one person was trying to do the work of several. She thought about the accounts. She thought about the corral with 4 horses and a place that sat 6 miles from town with no one to help if something went wrong. "You manage poorly," she said. He looked at her. She braced for something. Irritation, defensiveness, the reflexive bristling of a man whose competence had been questioned. He said, "Yeah." Just that. No argument, no explanation. Just the plain acknowledgement of a true thing. She was starting to think Colt Mercer might be one of the stranger people she'd ever encountered, and she had encountered a considerable range. They ate breakfast. She found eggs and salt pork and made them without asking if that was all right, because she was hungry and the provisions were there, and she had never seen the point in asking permission for things that were obviously reasonable. He ate without comment, which she took as approval. After breakfast, he went out to the horses and she began properly reorganizing the kitchen shelf. Because a disorganized shelf led to wasted time, and wasted time led to wasted money, and she had always found it easier to improve small things first, while she was figuring out how to approach the larger ones. She was on the second shelf when she heard him come back to the doorway. "I'm going to ride the north fence line," he said. "There's a section that needs new wire. Takes most of the morning." "All right. You'll be here alone." "I'm aware of how ranches work." A pause. "Do you ride?" She turned from the shelf. "No." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was processing something practical. "I'll teach you, not today, but you should know how. Out here it's not a skill, it's a necessity." "Then teach me," she said. No hesitation, because what was the point of hesitating over things that needed to be done? He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was beginning to identify as the one he wore when she'd said something that aligned with what he'd privately expected but hadn't wanted to assume. "Afternoon," he said. "After the fence." He left. She finished the shelves. "Mum," the morning passed quietly, which was something she hadn't expected to appreciate as much as she did. In the room above Hensley's store, quiet was rare. The street noise came through the floor, and Mrs. Hensley's voice carried through walls with the determined force of a woman who had never entirely believed in barriers of any kind. Here, the quiet was total. The wind moved through it, but didn't break it. The occasional sound from the corral was too far away to intrude. She worked through the ledgers until mid-morning, then walked the perimeter of the kitchen garden because she needed to move, and because she wanted to see what had been planted and what might come back in the spring. The rows were better kept than she'd expected. He'd put real thought into the layout, even if he hadn't gotten around to the accounts in the same way. Potatoes. She could see from the withered stalks. Turnips. A section that looked like it might have been beans. A small stand of something she thought might be winter squash, though the vines were too dead to be certain. She was kneeling to look at the soil. It was better than the soil in town, darker, with more give in it, when she heard hooves and looked up to see Colt coming down from the north ridge on a big roan horse that was covering ground with the smooth, ground-eating stride of a well-conditioned animal. He pulled up at the corral gate, dismounted without apparent effort, and led the horse inside. She watched him unsaddle it and check its feet with the automatic thoroughness of someone who didn't need to think about the steps anymore. He noticed her watching and didn't seem bothered by it. "Fence is done," he said. "I can see that. Come on, then." The horse he picked for her first lesson was a bay mare he called Della. Not a romantic name, he said, when she asked. She'd belonged to a man named Dell, who'd sold her 3 years ago when he moved his family to Oregon, and he'd never bothered to rename her because she already knew what she was called. Della was 12 years old, compact and patient, with a wide white blaze on her face and an expression that suggested she had seen beginners before and found them more tedious than frightening. Mara stood beside her in the corral and felt the particular combination of determination and unease that she associated with things she'd decided to do before she'd fully thought through the physical reality of them. "She won't hurt you," Colt said, from where he leaned against the corral fence. "I'm not afraid of her," Mara said. This was approximately true. She was not afraid in a way that felt like fear, more in a way that felt like respect for something significantly larger than herself. "Put your hand on her neck. Let her smell you." She did. Della turned her massive head and regarded her with one dark, liquid eye, then went back to being indifferent. "Now the saddle. Can't I just sit on her first without the saddle?" He looked at her. "You want to learn it right or learn it fast?" "Right," she said, without having to think about it. "Saddle's in the barn." He showed her how to saddle Della, not by doing it for her, but by doing it once himself on one of the other horses while narrating each step, and then undoing it and having her do it herself on Della. It took her 3 times as long as it had taken him. He didn't comment on the time. He pointed out twice, quietly and without any edge in his voice, where she'd gotten the cinch wrong and let her correct it herself. When she finally had it right, she looked up and found him watching with that expression she was starting to collect. The shadow of a satisfied thing passing through his face without stopping to announce itself. "Good," he said. 2 syllables. Somehow it mattered more than a longer compliment would have. Getting into the saddle was a different problem. She was not a small woman. She had always been solid, built from the same practical stock as her mother, whatever other qualities they'd failed to share, but the stirrup was still higher than felt reasonable, and Della was still considerably larger than seemed strictly necessary. She got her foot in on the second try and pulled herself up with the grim physical focus of someone who had decided they were going to do this and was simply waiting for their body to cooperate. She made it. She sat in the saddle, breathing a little harder than she'd have liked, and looked out from the height at the corral and the barn and the hills beyond, and the view was different up here. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make a sensible person rhapsodize about perspective, but different enough to notice. Below her, Colt was watching with his arms folded. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Strange," she said honestly. "It'll feel strange for a while. Don't try to fight it." The lesson lasted an hour and a half. By the end of it, she could walk Della in a circle in both directions, could stop her reliably, and had fallen off once, not badly, a slow sideways slide that deposited her in the corral dirt with more indignity than injury. She was back up and back in the saddle before Colt had finished crossing the corral toward her. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said, settling into the saddle and gathering the reins. "Walk her again?" He stopped mid-corral and looked up at her. "Walk her again," he said. Mutsum. That evening she was stiff in ways she hadn't anticipated, her inner thighs, her lower back, muscles she hadn't known she possessed now insisting on making themselves known. She said nothing about it because it seemed like information that should remain her own, and also because she had a feeling Colt was probably stiff in the shoulders from 3 hours of fence work and wasn't mentioning that either. They made supper together, which was not something she'd planned. She'd started on a pot of stew. There was a haunch of venison in the cold box, which he'd apparently shot sometime in the last week, along with root vegetables from the garden and dried herbs from a jar on the reorganized shelf. And he'd come in from checking the corral and simply started cutting the carrots without asking whether help was needed. She'd watched him do it for a moment and then kept working on her own side of things. They worked around each other in the kitchen with the careful courtesy of two people who don't know each other well enough to predict where the other one is going to move next. She stepped left when he stepped left, and they both stopped. And she stepped right, and so did he, and she said sorry, and he said no. And they finally sorted themselves out by him moving to the other side of the stove entirely, which she thought was probably the most sensible solution. "You hunted that yourself," she said, nodding at the venison. "Yes." "Do you do that often?" "When I need to. The cattle are for sale, not eating." He kept cutting. "You know how to cook venison?" "I know how to cook most things." She looked at him. "You?" "Functional cooking. Nothing that would impress anyone." "I'm not trying to impress anyone. Neither am I." There was a beat of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just empty in the way that sentences sometimes leave an empty space after them. "My mother," she said, and stopped. She hadn't intended to start that sentence. She started again. "I learned to cook because my mother made clear she had no interest in teaching me anything, which meant I had to teach myself, which meant I eventually got good at it by necessity." He set down the carrots and looked at her sidelong. "She was bad to you." It wasn't quite a question. She appreciated that. "She was ashamed of me," Mara said. "From the time I was old enough to understand what shame looked like on a person's face, she had very clear ideas about what a daughter was supposed to be, and I wasn't it." She kept stirring the pot. "She wasn't a bad woman entirely. She wanted something else. And I was what she got, and she never fully forgave either of us for it." The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the wind. "My father drank," Colt said, after a long moment. He said it the way he said most things, plainly without apparent feeling, though she was learning that the absence of apparent feeling and the absence of actual feeling were two different things in his case. Not mean about it, just gone. There but not there. You'd say something to him, and he'd look at you like he was trying to remember who you were. He paused. "He died when I was 17. I didn't feel the way I thought I was supposed to." "What did you feel?" He was quiet for a moment. "Like I could start." She understood that. She understood it in a way that went deeper than words, in the particular place where you keep the things you've never said out loud because you never had anyone to say them to. She stirred the stew. "The venison needs another 20 minutes, she said. "All right," he said. He went to the table and sat down and opened the account ledger she'd marked with her paper slips, not to look at it seriously, but with the air of a man who needed something to do with his hands while he waited. She watched him, briefly, from the side of her eye. The lamp on the table caught the line of his jaw, the way his brow pulled in slightly when he was reading, a reflex of concentration so habitual it had become a fixed feature of his face. His hands on the ledger were too large for the task, the way a carpenter's hands always look slightly absurd handling anything delicate. And yet he turned the pages carefully. She looked away. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply a person who paid attention to things, and he was simply a thing to be paid attention to, and there was nothing more complicated than that happening here. She had been clear. He had agreed to her terms. The situation was what it was. She served the stew. Obese. On the third morning, she woke to the sound of voices. 2 of them, male, coming from outside. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen window and saw Colt at the corral gate talking to a heavy-set man she didn't recognize and a younger man who stood slightly behind, holding the reins of 2 horses. The heavy-set man was doing most of the talking. Even through the glass, she could see something about the posture of the conversation that she didn't like. The way the heavy-set man stood too close, the way his hands moved when he talked, gestures that were slightly too large and too emphatic for friendly conversation. She put on the coffee and waited. Colt came in 10 minutes later. He poured a cup without sitting down, which she'd learned meant he was thinking through something while his hands did something automatic to give the rest of him time to catch up. "Who were they?" she asked. "Harlan Webb. He owns the spread south of mine. The boy's one of his hands." He drank the coffee. "He wants the water." "What water?" "There's a creek runs along my east pasture. It's on my land according to the county survey, but Webb's always said the survey's wrong. He's been trying to get Hargrove to push it to arbitration for 2 years. He set the cup down. "He heard I'd come back from town with... He heard about selection day." She looked at him steadily. "What did that have to do with anything?" "He figures a man's circumstances change when he takes a wife. Different calculations. Maybe I need the goodwill more than the water." He said it without emotion, just laying out the logic the way you'd lay out the pieces of something you were trying to fix. "He figures wrong," Mara said. Colt looked at her. "If the survey says it's your land, she said. "Goodwill doesn't change geography." She paused. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it. That was a mistake." He set down the cup. He didn't look offended. He looked again like a man receiving information he'd already suspected but wanted confirmed. "Why?" "Because 'I'll think about it' tells a man like that there's still room to negotiate. There isn't. You know there isn't. The right thing to do with a man like that is to be boring." She folded her hands on the table. "The less interesting your answer is, the less energy he has to work with. No is boring. 'I'll think about it' is interesting." Colt was quiet for a moment. "You know a man like that." "I've known several." She thought of the deputy. She thought of boys at school who'd been men like that in training. They rely on uncertainty. The moment you remove it, they don't know what to do. He sat down. He looked at his hands. He said, "He also said something about you." She waited. "He made a joke about why I would have chosen what I chose, about what it says about a man who—" He stopped. His jaw had tightened in a way that was slightly different from his ordinary expression. "I'm not going to repeat it." "I've heard the joke," she said, "in various versions. It wasn't—" He stopped again. Something moved through his face that she hadn't seen there before, something with more heat in it. "He said it to my face. On my land. That was deliberate." "Of course it was deliberate. Men like that are always deliberate." She met his gaze. "You're angry." "Yes." "At him or at the situation?" He looked at her. "Both." She nodded. "The anger at him is useful. Hold on to that. The anger at the situation you should probably let go, because it's a waste of energy and the situation isn't going to change regardless." He stared at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something that was somewhere between surprise and something else. Something that hadn't fully decided what it was yet. "You're a strange person," he said. "I've been told." "I mean it as something good." She looked at him. "I know you do," she said. And she believed it, which surprised her less than it would have 3 days ago. The weeks that followed had a shape that she hadn't expected. Not the shape of a story, where things build toward a resolution in ways you can see coming. More the shape of actual days, which is to say, uneven. Harder in some places than others. Better in some moments than she'd prepared herself for. She rode Della every afternoon. By the end of the second week, she could trot without losing her seat. By the end of the third, she could manage a canter in the corral, though it still felt like being shaken in a jar, and she said so, and Colt said that was about right for 3 weeks, and she'd stop feeling that way by spring. He said, by spring, as a matter of course, and she noticed it, the way he'd placed her in the future of the ranch as an obvious fact rather than a negotiation, and she filed it away in the place where she kept things that needed time to settle before she could decide what to think about them. The accounts she had under control within 10 days. She built a system, explained it to him, and wrote the key principles out on a card she tacked to the inside of the ledger cover so that even if she weren't available to help, the logic was preserved. He followed the system exactly as she'd described it. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected the usual combination of initial enthusiasm and gradual drift that characterized most people's relationship with organized record-keeping. He was consistent. Every evening he made his entries in that careful, deliberate hand following the structure she'd given him. She watched him do it one evening from across the kitchen. He didn't know she was watching, or if he did, he didn't show it, and felt something she recognized slowly as the specific satisfaction of having built something useful. The kitchen garden she reclaimed incrementally, in the margins of time between other things. Not planting, it was too late in the season, but clearing, composting, preparing. She found an old plan he'd drawn on a piece of paper, left in the back of a kitchen drawer, showing what he'd intended the garden to be. His handwriting was blocky, the lines slightly crooked, the layout more ambitious than practical. She improved the design and left the revised sketch on the table one morning without comment. He found it when he came in for midday coffee. He looked at it for a long time. He said nothing. That evening, he brought in a load of compost from the barn pile without being asked and spread it over the beds she'd indicated. She had not expected to feel at home here. She was not sure she did. Home was a word with weight to it, and she'd been careful about words with weight for a long time. But she felt something. She felt the absence of bracing. She felt the absence of that constant low-level alertness she'd maintained in Blackthorn Ridge, the animal readiness to absorb something unkind. It was not a grand discovery. It was more like realizing slowly that you'd been cold for a very long time and were finally not cold. The first time she cried on the ranch, it was over nothing. Or rather, it was over a small thing that had nothing to do with the ranch at all, and everything to do with something she'd been carrying for years. She was sorting through one of her canvas bags, the second one, which she hadn't fully unpacked, and she found, wrapped in an old piece of cloth at the bottom, a small-looking glass she'd owned since she was a girl. 6 inches of mirror in a tin frame painted green with a crack across the lower left corner. Her mother had thrown it at her when Mara was 12 years old, in a moment of, she didn't even remember what. The glass had survived the throw, but the corner had cracked. She kept it anyway. She wasn't sure why. Some version of stubbornness that even her 12-year-old self had managed to maintain. She sat on the edge of the cot with the looking glass in her hands and did not cry at first. She just looked at it, and then at her own face reflected in it, distorted slightly by the crack in the warped old glass. And then she was crying, and she wasn't entirely sure when it had started. She was crying for the 12-year-old who'd picked up the thrown glass and kept it. She was crying for selection day, all 4 of them. She was crying for her mother's face in the moments before it had closed off into disappointment, because there were moments, there had always been moments, before the disappointment settled in when her mother's face had something else in it, something that might have been love if it had found a different shape. She was still on the cot when she heard Colt in the kitchen. She could tell by the time that it was later than she'd realized that she'd been sitting there longer than she'd known. She set the looking glass on the shelf. She washed her face with the water from the small pitcher on the floor. She blew her nose. She went to the kitchen. He was at the stove. He looked at her once and then back at the stove. He said nothing about it. She sat at the table and opened the ledger to the day's entry page. After a moment, he brought her coffee. He set it down beside her elbow, the way he'd done the first morning and most mornings since, without making it into anything. "Thank you," she said. "Sure," he said. He went back to the stove. She held the warm cup in both hands and breathed and thought, for the first time in several years, that she was going to be all right. Not perfect. Not healed in some permanent and final way. Just all right, in the ordinary sense. The kind of all right that is built from days rather than moments, from accumulated small evidences rather than transformations. She would take it. Outside, the evening had come down quickly the way it did in October, the sky going dark at the edges first and working inward. The windmill turned. One of the horses in the corral called out to nothing in particular and then went quiet. Colt set 2 plates on the table. She closed the ledger. "What did you make?" she asked. "Salt pork again." He sat down. "We need to go to town. Provisions are getting low." She looked up from her plate. Town meant Blackthorn Ridge. It meant the square where she'd stood 4 times and come away from 3 times with nothing. It meant the deputy's voice and Ida Rourke's eyes and the specific texture of being looked at like something that had been placed in the wrong location. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "We can go to Millhaven instead. 8 miles further, but the general store there is decent." She thought about it. She thought about what it would mean to avoid Blackthorn Ridge permanently, what kind of shape that would give her life, what she would be deciding about herself by choosing the longer road. No, she said. Blackthorn Ridge. He looked at her steadily. You're sure? I'm sure. She cut a piece of pork. If I avoid it, it becomes something. If I go, it's just a town. He was quiet for a moment. We'll go Thursday, he said. She nodded. She ate. The salt pork was the same as it had been every other night he'd made it. Functional, without particular merit. The food of someone who ate to sustain himself rather than for pleasure. She made a note to teach him to do something with dried herbs, which they had in abundance and which he apparently believed existed purely for decorative purposes. She would tell him tomorrow. Tonight she ate what was on the plate and listened to the wind against the kitchen window and felt the full quiet weight of where she was and what she'd managed, in 3 weeks, to make of it. Not a life. Not yet. But the materials for one, laid out around her with more care than she'd expected from the man across the table or from herself. That was something. Outside, the first stars were coming out over the ridge. She could see them through the window above the dry sink, sharp and cold and indifferent, the way stars always are. She had always liked them better for that, for the fact that they shone the same for everyone and made no judgment about who deserved the light. She drank her coffee. She let herself rest. Thursday came with a sky the color of old iron and a wind that had made up its mind to be unpleasant about it. Mara was up before the sun again. She had, in the weeks since arriving at the ranch, settled into the rhythm of the place the way you settle into a chair that wasn't built for you but is the only chair available, with adjustments, with small concessions, and then with something that gradually stopped feeling like compromise. She made the fire. She made the coffee. She took stock of the provisions that remained and wrote a list in the back of the ledger where she'd started keeping household accounts separate from the ranch books, because mixing them was how errors compounded. She heard Colt moving in the house. His bedroom was at the far end of the hall, past the room that served as a kind of storage for the things ranch life accumulated and didn't quite need but couldn't justify throwing out. He was a quiet mover, which she'd noticed early and which struck her as unusual in a man his size. Not careful exactly, just contained, like he'd learned at some point to take up only the space he needed and no more. He came into the kitchen and looked at the list she'd set on the table. "You've been up a while?" he said. "An hour." She poured his coffee. "There's more we need than I thought. The flour's almost gone. We've been through the salt faster than I expected." He picked up the list and read it. He had the habit of reading with his lips slightly apart, not moving, just open, like a man who'd learned to read late and still found it required a particular quality of attention. She had never mentioned it. It was not the kind of thing that needed mentioning. "The Webb situation," he said, without looking up from the list. "What about it?" "He's going to be in town today. He usually is on Thursdays, goes to the land office in the morning and the saloon after." He set the list down. "I want you to know that ahead of time." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because he's not going to say anything good, and I'd rather you were prepared than surprised." She appreciated it. The preparation, the plain delivery of it, the absence of any suggestion that preparation might not be necessary, because surely nothing bad would happen. People who told you surely nothing bad would happen had generally never been the kind of person things happened to. "I'm not easily surprised," she said. "But thank you." He drank his coffee. She folded the list and put it in her coat pocket. They left an hour later, the wagon loaded with 2 empty crates for provisions and a harness piece that needed repair at the leather shop. The road south ran along the creek for the first 2 miles through the remnant of the cottonwood stand that had shed most of its leaves by now, leaving a lace of bare branches against the gray sky. The creek was running lower than it had been. The fall had been dry, Colt said, and if November didn't bring rain, the east pasture would be difficult come spring. She listened to him talk about water and pasture and the calculations a rancher made about seasons the way other people made calculations about money. She had not known, before coming to this place, how much of a rancher's mind was occupied by weather, not as a topic but as a variable, a constant unknown that every plan had to be built around without being able to account for. She was beginning to understand that what looked like stubbornness in men like Colt was often something closer to the long practice of planning for uncertainty. You could not be rigid and survive a decade of this. You had to know which things you could control and which things you simply had to outlast. She thought she had been doing something similar for most of her life, without ever having a name for it. Blackthorn Ridge appeared as they rounded the last curve of the road. The church steeple first, then the brown line of rooftops against the hills, then the specific geography of Main Street resolving itself into individual buildings. She had not seen it in 3 weeks. It looked smaller than she remembered, which she understood was not about the town but about herself. "You all right?" Colt asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it, mostly. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, which was on the western end of Main Street, away from the square. She climbed down on her own side. The door of the store opened and Owen Marsh came out. He was the owner, a thin man with a thin mustache who had always treated Mara with the particular brand of neutrality that some people deployed when they couldn't decide whether to be kind or unkind and found the middle ground more comfortable. He stopped on the step and looked at them both with an expression that cycled through several things quickly before settling on businesslike. "Mercer," he said, "I heard that you'd been by Selection Day." "I was," Colt said. Marsh looked at Mara. "Miss Whitlock." "Mrs. Mercer," Mara said. She had not planned to say it. She heard herself say it and registered a small internal surprise. But she had said it, and it sat in the air between them with a kind of solidity that surprised her further. Marsh blinked. "Yes, of course." He cleared his throat. "Well, come in." She went in. Chad. The store smelled of dust and linseed oil and the particular sweetness of dried goods stored in a closed space: sugar, cornmeal, dried beans. She had spent enough time in Hensley's store to find the smell familiar, even comforting, and she moved through the space with the easy efficiency of someone who knows how general stores are organized because she has spent years in one. She gave Marsh the list. He filled it from the shelves without much conversation, which was fine. She examined the bolts of fabric near the window, not because she needed fabric urgently, but because knowing what was available was the kind of information that had practical use later, and was looking at a length of dark blue wool when the door opened. She knew without turning around. Something in the quality of the silence that followed the bell told her. "Well," Deputy Roy Strand said from the doorway, "look at that." She turned. He was with another man she recognized, Pete Nevers's son, who was 22 and had inherited his father's habit of standing too close to other people's conversations. Strand was leaning against the doorframe with the comfortable posture of a man who had decided in advance that whatever happened next would be entertaining. "Mercer's wife," he said, putting a particular tone on the two words that made them mean something other than what they said. Mara folded her hands in front of her. She thought of what she'd told Colt. Be boring. Remove the uncertainty. Don't give them anything interesting to work with. "Deputy?" she said pleasantly, as if greeting an acquaintance she hadn't thought about in some time. Strand looked at Never's son and smiled the smile of a man who has an audience. "You're looking," he paused, theatrical. "Settled. Ranching agrees with you?" "It does," she said. She turned back to the fabric. "I heard Mercer's place is something to see, out there all alone, 6 miles from anywhere." His voice had the quality of a man circling. "Quiet, I'd imagine." "Very quiet," she said. She examined the blue wool. "Peaceful. Must be a change," he said, "from your previous situation." She did not answer. She ran her thumb along the edge of the fabric and thought about whether the weight of it was sufficient for the coat she was considering making and whether she had the pattern for it or would need to draft one from memory. "I said," Strand began, his voice taking on a different quality. The quality it got when being ignored irritated him past the point of performance. "It must be quite a change." "I heard you," she said. She looked at Marsh. "I'll take 2 yards of the blue. And do you have thread to match?" Marsh, who had been standing behind his counter with the expression of a man who wished he were somewhere that was not here, went to find thread. Strand was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Never's son, but loudly enough for the whole store, "Reckon a woman who spent 4 selection days getting passed over would be grateful for anything she got." She put the fabric down on the counter. She had a choice here. She had always had choices. The question was what kind and what each one cost. She could say nothing, which was what she had always done, and which would preserve the peace in the immediate sense while surrendering something she was increasingly unwilling to surrender. She could say something cutting, which would feel good for about 3 seconds, and then provide Strand with the reaction he was fishing for. or she could say the true thing, which was neither of those. She turned and looked at him, directly, without the careful glancing away she had practiced for years. "You know what I notice about you, Roy?" she said. His given name. The intimacy of it was small and deliberate. "You've been making the same joke for 4 years. You made it in the square at Selection Day. You made it to Colt's face when he drove me out of town. And you're making it now in Owen Marsh's store to a man who laughs because you're his deputy, and it's easier than not laughing." She tilted her head slightly. "That's a long time to keep telling the same joke. Usually when something's still funny, you don't have to keep reminding people." Strand's face went through several things. Never's son stopped smiling. "I'm not looking for a fight," she said. "I never have been. I'm here to buy flour and thread and a harness piece, and then I'm going back to the ranch, and tomorrow I'm going to do the same things I did yesterday." She picked up the folded fabric. "Have a good morning?" She turned back to the counter. Behind her, she heard nothing for a long moment. Then the door opened and closed. Marsh set the thread on the counter. He looked at it, not at her. "That'll be 60 cents, he said, "for the fabric and thread together." "Thank you," she said. She paid him. Colt was at the leather shop when she came out. She found him there 5 minutes later, the harness piece over the counter, discussing the repair with the leather worker in the shorthand of men who understand the same equipment and don't need to describe it at length. He looked at her when she came in, a quick assessment, the kind that checked for damage without appearing to, and then back at the leather worker. When the repair had been arranged and they were back on the street, he said, "Strand was at the general store." He was. "I saw him go in." He was walking beside her, not fast. "You all right?" "I'm fine." She paused. "I said something to him." "What kind of something?" She told him, briefly. He listened without expression. When she finished, he said, "That was better than what I would have said." "What would you have said?" "Something that would have required the sheriff's involvement." She almost smiled. "The boring answer is usually better. You told me that. I'm telling you again." They walked back to the wagon. The street was doing its usual Thursday business around them. A woman with a basket crossing toward the bakery. 2 men loading a cart outside the feed store. Someone's dog investigating the base of the dead oak in the square with committed interest. She felt eyes on her as she walked. She always had, in this town. But the quality of the looking was different now. Less like an audience watching a spectacle, and more like people who have seen something unexpected and haven't decided yet how to classify it. She climbed up to the wagon seat. Harlan Webb was coming out of the land office at the far end of the street. She saw him and Colt saw him at the same time. Webb was a big man, not tall like Colt, but wide, substantial, with a red face and the rolling walk of someone who had gotten used to other people moving out of his way. He had his hat pushed back on his head and a folder of papers under his arm, and an expression of purposeful good humor that Mara recognized as the expression men like Webb wore when they were about to say something they'd been saving. He saw them. He altered his course. Mara sat very still on the wagon seat. "Mercer," Webb said, stopping in the street with the easy arrogance of a man who had never once worried about blocking someone's way. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Provisions," Colt said. "Simple. Flat." Sure. Webb's eyes went to Mara. Something moved in them. Not quite a leer, because Webb was smarter than a man who leered in public, but something adjacent to it. Something that had made the decision to be civil while retaining the intent behind incivility. "Mrs. Mercer." She inclined her head. "I was just at the land office," Webb said, directing this at Colt. "Had a good conversation with Edgar Pine about the East Creek survey." He paused, letting the pause do work. "Seems like there's some genuine ambiguity in the county records. Edgar thinks it might be worth a formal review." "Edgar Pine does what you tell him," Colt said. Webb smiled. "Now, that's an unfriendly reading of a man just doing his job." He shifted his weight, a movement that brought him an inch closer, which Mara thought was calculated to the inch. "I'm just saying there's a process available, a legitimate one. And a man in your circumstances might want to think about what it costs to fight a process like that versus what it costs to be neighborly." "We've had this conversation," Colt said. "We have. I'm just wondering if things have changed. Man's situation changes. His calculations change." The smile again, still in its civil register. certain responsibilities, certain expenses. She watched Colt's hands on the reins. The knuckles had gone white at the base of his index finger. That was all. One knuckle, barely visible. But she saw it. "Mr. Webb," she said. Both men looked at her. She had their attention, which was what she'd intended. She kept her voice at the same pleasant register she'd used with Strand. Not warm, not cold, just the voice of a person conducting ordinary business. The county survey was filed in 1871 and recorded in Harmon County under deed reference 4-47-J. The East Creek boundary runs 12 feet inside the Mercer property line at its narrowest point and 19 feet at its widest. I confirmed this 2 days ago against the carbon copy in the ranch records. She paused. Edgar Pine can request a formal review. The outcome will be the same as the survey. The process will cost you filing fees and time, and the result won't change. She looked at him steadily. "I'm an account keeper, Mr. Webb. Numbers don't negotiate." Webb stared at her. He had not expected that. She could see it in the way his smile had lost its shape. Not collapsed, exactly, but slipped, the way a mask slips when the face behind it makes an expression the mask wasn't designed to accommodate. "Well," he said after a moment, "you've been doing your homework." "I do it every day," she said. "It's my job." He looked at Colt. Colt looked back at him with the expression of a man who has nothing to add to what has already been said. Webb resettled his hat. "I'll see you around, Mercer." "I expect so," Colt said. Webb walked away. His rolling, purposeful stride was slightly less purposeful than it had been when he'd approached, in a way that only someone watching for it would notice. Mara unwrapped her hands from where they'd been folded in her lap. She had not noticed she'd been holding them that tightly. Colt looked at her. "You actually looked at the deed reference?" "Of course I did." She shook out her hands once. "I found it in the ranch papers when I was reorganizing the document box. It seemed like something worth knowing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, 447J. "I have a good memory for numbers." He took up the reins. He started the horses moving. He said nothing else until they were past the edge of town and onto the north road, with the creek beginning to appear on their left through the bare cottonwoods. Then he said, "Thank you." 2 words. She had been learning to hear the weight of things in 2 words. "You'd have done the same," she said. "I'd have said something that required the sheriff's involvement." "I know." The horses moved at an even pace. The wind had eased slightly. Above the east ridge, a strip of pale light had appeared where the clouds had thinned. Not quite sun, but the suggestion of it. "Strand and Webb," Colt said after a while. "What about them?" "In one morning." "It was only an hour," she said. He looked at her sideways. That shadow of a smile, the one she'd been cataloging without exactly deciding to, passed through his face. "You're either the bravest person I've met," he said, "or the most stubborn." "Those aren't as different as people think," she said. Tut-tut. When they got back to the ranch, she carried provisions in while he saw to the horses, and then she started a proper supper, a real one this time, not salt pork. She'd bought dried beans and a smoked ham hock at the store, and she put them together in the pot with the dried herbs that had been sitting on the reorganized shelf doing nothing since she'd arrived. You had to soak the beans first, but there was time, and she liked the rhythm of cooking that required patience rather than speed. She was elbow-deep in the reorganization of the cold box, which had never been organized on any principle she could identify, when Colt came in. He stopped at the kitchen door and looked at what she was doing. "The cold box needed," she started. "I know," he said. He didn't sound irritated. He sounded like a man who has known the cold box needed organizing for some time and has not done it, which is a different thing. He went to wash up, and she finished the cold box and checked the beans, and then sat at the table with the ledger, because the ledger was where she went when she needed something familiar to do with her mind while the rest of her settled. He came back and sat across from her, and she became aware, without looking up, that he wasn't doing anything. He had his coffee, and he wasn't picking up his own papers or going out again or starting on anything. He was just sitting. "You're staring at me," she said, to the ledger. "I'm thinking," he said. "You do that a lot at the table." "It's a good place to think." She looked up. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, which was something she'd observed he gave rarely and completely. When it was there, It was entirely there, not parceled out among several things. It was a disconcerting quality, not because it was hostile, but because she was not accustomed to being looked at with genuine attention rather than with judgment. "What?" she said. "I was thinking about today." "Which part?" "Both parts. Strand and web." He turned his cup in his hands, a gesture she recognized as the physical equivalent of finding words. "Neither one of them." He paused. "I've dealt with both of them for years. I know how they operate. But there's a difference between knowing how something operates and being able to dismantle it while you're standing in the middle of it." She said nothing. "You did that," he said, "twice, in one morning. And you made it look—" He stopped, shook his head slightly. "You made it look like you were just having a conversation." "I was just having a conversation," she said. "No, you weren't." She was quiet for a moment. "All right. No, I wasn't." She looked at the ledger. "I've spent a long time learning to say things in ways that don't look like what they are. When you grow up the way I did, you can't fight in the ways other people fight. You can't be loud or physical or intimidating, so you learn to fight in the ways that are available to you." She closed the ledger. "Clarity is available to anyone." He was looking at her with the same quality of attention. "That's what it was," he said slowly. "Clarity. You can't argue with a specific number," she said. 447J, 19 feet at the widest point. There's nothing to grab onto. The argument just—" She made a small gesture. "Slides off." He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, a habit she'd noticed when he was working something out. "When I came to this valley," he said, "I was 24 years old and I had $400 and a borrowed horse. I built this place with those things and 11 years of work." He looked back at her. "I'm not good at the talking of things. I know the work. I know what needs doing, and I can do it. But the talking is—" He stopped. "The talking is a different kind of work." "You talk fine," she said. "I talk when I know what I mean to say. The rest of the time He made a slight gesture with one hand. "I leave spaces." "I know." She had in fact learned to read the spaces. They were informative in their own way. "It's not a flaw. It costs me sometimes." "Webb," she said. "Webb. And others." He drank his coffee. "Having someone who can—" He stopped again, and this time the stop was longer. And when he came back from it, his voice had a different quality, more deliberate, like a man choosing each word individually. "Having someone who can do that, who thinks that way, it changes what's possible." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not saying it as a romantic declaration. She was clear enough by now on what romantic declarations from Colt Mercer would and would not sound like. And this was not that register. He was saying it the way he said things about the fence line and the pasture and the water calculations. Plainly, because it was true, and because the truth of it needed to be acknowledged, or it would go on being a thing they were both aware of without acknowledging. "I know," she said. "The same is true the other direction." He looked at her. "How so?" "You know how to build things," she said. "Not the accounts, not the talking. The actual physical building of a life in a place. The fence lines and the water rights and the pasture calculations and the knowledge of when to hold out and when to let go." She put her hands flat on the table. "I know how to organize things. I know how to find errors and correct them. I know how numbers work and people work and how to say the true thing in the least flammable way possible." She looked at him. "But I've never had anywhere to apply it. Anywhere it actually mattered." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the gaps in the barn walls, making a low, thoughtful sound. "It matters here," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm saying." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his cup. He looked at the window. The strip of pale light over the east ridge had lasted into the late afternoon and was only now dimming back into cloud. "Beans will be ready in another hour," she said. "All right," he said. She opened the ledger. He picked up the document box, the one she'd reorganized, and began going through it with the look of a man who now knew what was in it and was checking something specific, which was different from how he'd gone through it before. The difference was small and difficult to name, but she saw it. He moved through the papers with the beginnings of a system. She had given him that. She bent over the ledger and worked, and the lamp came on and the beans finished an hour later, filling the kitchen with the particular smell of something that had been cooking slowly long enough to become something other than its ingredients. She served them in 2 bowls with the bread she'd made that morning from the last of the flour. He ate in silence for a few minutes, which was his way, and she ate and thought about the blue wool in her bag and the coat she was planning and whether the pattern she had in her head would work or whether she'd need to adjust the shoulders. "Good," he said, nodding at the beans. "The ham hock makes it," she said. "Without the fat, you'd just have beans." "I've had just beans." "I know. That's why I bought the ham hock." He looked at her over the bowl, the shadow of the smile. She had started to think of it as a private thing. Not private from him, but private in the sense that it wasn't for anyone else. Not the town, not Webb, not anyone outside this kitchen. "Thank you," he said. Again. The same 2 words as on the wagon, but different in weight now, covering more. "Stop thanking me," she said. "We're both here. We both work." "All right," he said.
"All right," she said. They finished the beans, she washed the bowls. He dried them without being asked, which he had started doing somewhere in the 2nd week, without either of them marking the beginning of it.
Later, in the small room off the kitchen, she lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about the day. About Strand's face when she'd said what she'd said. About Webb's smile losing its shape in the street. About Colt's hands on the reins, one knuckle going white, and the particular steadiness of sitting beside someone who trusted her to handle a thing the way she was capable of handling it. She had been handled carefully, by most people, for most of her life, with the carefulness of people managing something fragile or inconvenient. She had been worked around, accommodated, avoided. This was different. This was someone standing beside her and pointing at the horizon and saying, "You see that? Yes, then go." She was not naive about what it was. She understood that trust built slowly, and that 3 weeks was 3 weeks, and that there were 100 ways this could still go wrong. She was not the kind of person who confused the beginning of something for the whole of it, but she held the day in her mind anyway. Strand and Webb and the wagon rode north with the pale light over the ridge, and she let herself have it in the plain and uncomplicated sense of allowing a thing to exist without immediately anticipating its end. She had not been good at that. She was practicing. November arrived without apology. The first hard frost came on a Tuesday, 3 days into the month, and it killed the last of what was left in the kitchen garden with a thoroughness that Mara found almost admirable. She stood at the window that morning with her coffee and looked at the blackened stalks and thought about the revised garden plan she'd left on the table back in October, which Colt had read and then set in the document box under the category she'd labeled spring work. The category had not existed before she'd made it. Now it held 11 pages of notes. She had started to notice how much of the ranch's future she had quietly inserted herself into without intending to. Not as a claim, she was careful about claims, having spent most of her life watching other people make them carelessly, but as a presence. The spring planting schedule, the projected accounts for the first quarter of next year, the list of fence sections that needed new wire before the ground froze and made the work impossible. These were things she had done because they needed doing, and no one else was going to do them, and because she had a mind that was poorly suited to leaving problems unaddressed once she'd identified them. She had not, 3 weeks ago, expected to be thinking about next spring. She was still not entirely sure what to make of the fact that she was. Colt came in from the early chores, feeding the horses, checking the water trough, the small repetitive maintenance that a ranch required before the day could officially begin, and stood in the kitchen doorway knocking frost from his boot soles against the step. His breath made clouds in the air outside. He came in and shut the door and looked at the window and said, "Garden's done." "Yes," she said. "We'll do better next year." He said it without looking at her, hanging his coat on the hook, already moving toward the stove. "I was thinking, there's a south-facing slope below the barn that doesn't frost as early. Might be worth moving some of the beds." She turned from the window. "I mapped it 2 weeks ago. It's in the spring folder." He stopped at the stove. He looked at her over his shoulder with an expression she had learned to identify as the one he wore when she'd done something that reached slightly further forward than he'd expected. Of course it is, he said. The slope gets an extra 3 weeks at either end of the season, she said. Maybe 4, depending on the year. That's carrots and turnips earlier, possibly potatoes. Possibly. The soil there is stonier, but the drainage is better, which matters more. She sat at the table. I was thinking we should go to Millhaven next week. The seed merchant there carries a broader variety than Marsh's store. If we order before December, we get the winter price. He was quiet for a moment, making the coffee. Then, Millhaven's a long day. I know. You'd want to leave early, come back late. He turned. Or stay overnight. She looked at him. Is there somewhere to stay? One inn, decent enough from what I hear. I don't go to Millhaven much. He poured the coffee. We could stay one night, make the trip worth the distance. All right, she said. He set her cup beside her elbow. He sat down. He opened the document box, which was now organized, which still produced in him the faint expression of a man encountering something he'd been told about and kept being pleasantly surprised to find, and pulled out the spring folder. Show me, he said. She showed him. They sat together over the kitchen table, and she walked him through the slope measurements and the frost data she'd collected from his own weather notes, which had been kept in the back of an old ledger with no system but considerable accuracy, and he listened the way he listened when information was relevant, which was to say, completely, without dividing his attention, asking questions that were short and precise, and that told her he was tracking not just the details, but the logic that connected them. This was, she had come to understand, the shape their days had taken. Not romantic in any conventional sense. There were no declarations, no moments staged for effect. But something was being built. She could feel it the way you feel a structure being assembled in stages. First the foundation, then the framing, then the walls that make the whole thing able to stand against weather. She was not sure what to call it. She was not sure she needed to, yet. The trouble with Harlan Webb did not go away because she had recited a deed reference at him in the street. She had known it wouldn't. Men like Webb didn't abandon positions because you demonstrated the positions were untenable. They reassessed, regrouped, found different angles. She had told Colt this on the ride home from that first Thursday in town, and he had agreed with the resigned certainty of someone who'd known Webb for 11 years and had no illusions about his capacity for persistence. What she hadn't anticipated was the form the next approach would take. It came on a Friday afternoon in early November, and it didn't come from Webb directly. It came from Sheriff Hargrove, who rode up to the ranch house alone, without his deputy, which was in itself a signal worth reading. She was in the kitchen garden, or rather, in what remained of it, clearing the frost-killed stalks when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see the sheriff dismounting at the gate. Colt was in the barn. She heard the sound of his work stop as he registered the arrival, and then his boots on the frozen ground as he came out. Hargrove was a man who moved like he was always about to shake someone's hand, forward-leaning, deliberate, projecting the confidence of someone who expected to be received well. He had been Blackthorn Ridge's sheriff for 12 years, and he had the settled authority of a man who had been right about things often enough that he had stopped building in allowances for the possibility of being wrong. Mercer, he said. Mrs. Mercer. He caught himself on the title, nodded at her once. Sheriff, Colt said. Something I can help you with? Hope so. Hargrove pushed his hat back on his head in a gesture she recognized. It was the same one Webb had used in the street, the gesture of a man preparing to say something he had pre-decided was reasonable. I've been having some conversations with Harlan Webb about the East Creek boundary. I've had those conversations myself, Colt said. He's filed a formal petition with the county. It'll go to arbitration in March unless the parties reach a resolution beforehand. Hargrove said it evenly, without apparent pressure, just information. I want to be clear that I'm here as a neighbor, not in any official capacity. That's an interesting distinction to draw, Mara said, given that you rode out in your official capacity and mentioned a formal county petition in your first breath. Hargrove looked at her. His expression had the quality of a man who is used to being the person in the room who says things that reframe other things, and who finds the experience of having it done to him mildly disorienting. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I was speaking to your husband. I keep the ranch accounts and correspondence, she said pleasantly. Anything pertaining to the property pertains to me. She set down the bundle of dead stalks she'd been holding. What resolution is Webb proposing? A pause. He's suggesting a compensated boundary adjustment, a fair market payment for the 12-foot strip along the creek. The 19-foot strip at its widest, she said. And what's his figure for fair market? Hargrove named a number. She kept her face neutral. The number was approximately 40% of what the strip was worth, based on the per-acre value she'd calculated from comparable county land records she'd found in the document box, filed under a category Colt had labeled, optimistically, legal stuff. That's not a fair market figure, she said. It's a low market figure dressed in fair market language. Hargrove's jaw tightened slightly. Appraisals vary. They do, she agreed, but the variation is usually within 15% of an honest assessment. That number is 40% below. She tilted her head. Did Webb's appraiser do the valuation, or was it an independent party? The silence was answer enough. Colt had been standing slightly back during this, and she was aware of him there. Not because he was deferring to her, she didn't think it was that simple, but because he had identified that this was the kind of exchange that required the particular kind of precision she was better equipped to deliver, and he had made the decision without apparent difficulty to let her deliver it. It was a quality she had not expected in him and had been unable to stop thinking about since she'd first observed it. Not the stepping back exactly, but the lack of ego in the stepping back. The absence of any need to perform competence he wasn't currently deploying. I'm not here to negotiate on Webb's behalf, Hargrove said, with a slight edge that told her she'd gotten under something. Then why are you here? She asked. Simply, no edge in return. Hargrove looked at Colt. Mercer, I'm trying to keep this from becoming a county matter. Arbitration takes time and money from everyone. It takes more from the party in the wrong, Colt said, which isn't me. The survey is 30 years old. Surveys don't expire, Mara said, and the county record corroborates it. If Webb wants arbitration, we'll attend arbitration, and we'll bring the deed reference and the comparable valuations and the county record, and the arbitrator will have a complete picture. She folded her hands. We're not interested in a resolution that costs us land we own. We're perfectly willing to participate in a process that confirms what the records already show. Hargrove stood in the yard for a moment with the look of a man recalculating something he had expected to be simpler. All right, he said finally. I'll convey that. Please do, she said. He rode out. She bent and picked up the bundle of dead stalks and walked to the compost pile at the corner of the garden and dropped them there. Behind her, she heard Colt's boots on the ground as he came to stand beside her. He'll tell Webb you're difficult, he said. Good, she said. Webb already knows I'm not going to give him the creek, but Hargrove needed to find out for himself. She looked at the compost pile. Webb sent him because he thought a sheriff would carry more weight than a neighbor. He was calculating on... She stopped, chose the word carefully. He was calculating that things here might be arranged in a particular way, that you would handle the official visit and I would handle the kitchen. Colt was quiet for a moment. He was wrong about that. He was. She dusted dead plant matter from her hands. He'll adjust his calculations. He won't stop, but he'll adjust. What does he try next? Something slower, she said. Something that doesn't require a conversation. Webb is smart enough to know that conversations with me don't go the way he wants. So next he'll try paperwork. Delays. Bureaucratic friction. She thought about it. We should write to the county assessor's office directly, before March. A letter establishing our position with the supporting documentation so that when he files his arbitration petition, our response is already on record. Colt looked at her. Will you write it? He said. Yes. She brushed the last of the dead matter from her sleeve. Tonight, if you can tell me the exact dates of any previous correspondence with the county about the property. It's in the document box, under legal stuff. I know where it is, she said. I organized it. He almost smiled. Right. Present. That evening, she wrote the letter. It took 2 hours and 4 drafts, because the language of county correspondence required a particular kind of precision. Not the precision of ordinary clear speech, but the precision of legal communication, where individual word choices accumulated into positions that were difficult to walk back from. She had learned something about this from watching her mother deal with the various small legal matters that arose in the life of a woman who owned a small house and had disputes with neighbors about where one property ended and another began. Her mother had always been badly positioned in those disputes, because she had argued from emotion rather than record, and from a position of wanting to be recognized as right rather than simply being right in terms that couldn't be argued with. Mara had watched her lose ground in arguments she shouldn't have lost, and had absorbed somewhere in the watching the inverse lesson. She read the finished letter to Colt at the kitchen table. He listened. When she finished, he said, "That'll hold." "It should. We may need a second letter after the arbitration date is set, but this establishes intent and gives the assessor's office a reason to look at the record before Webb's petition lands on their desk." "You know how to do things," he said. It was a strange compliment, and she sat with it for a moment, turning it over. "I know how to do some things," she said. "Not everything. Nobody knows everything." "No." She folded the letter. "But I know what I know, and I know which things I don't know well enough to leave alone." She looked at him. "I don't know how to fix a fence. I learned to ride 6 weeks ago. I don't know the first thing about calving season or what a heifer looks like when she's in trouble, and those gaps will matter come spring." He was quiet. Then, "I can teach you calving signs. It's not complicated. You just have to know what you're looking at." "I know." She set the letter on the document box. "I'm saying I have gaps. I'm not the complete answer to every problem this place has." "Neither am I," he said. He said it simply, the way he said things that were obvious and true, and that he apparently saw no reason to dress up. That's the whole point of two people. She looked at him. He looked back at her without any self-consciousness about what he'd said, or any apparent awareness that it had landed differently than ordinary conversation. "That's the whole point of two people," she repeated quietly. "Yes," he said. She looked at the letter on the document box. She looked at the lamp on the table. She was aware, with a kind of clarity that was not comfortable exactly, but was not the opposite of comfortable either, that something had shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but shifted. She had been very careful, since arriving here, not to let herself want things she hadn't been offered. It was an old discipline, one of the oldest she had, built from the repeated experience of allowing herself to want something, and finding the wanting made the absence of it sharper. She had kept the discipline here with the same determination she brought to everything, and it had served her. But she was sitting across from a man who had, without making anything of it, without staging it, without any evident awareness that he was doing something that might matter, said that the whole point of two people was that each covered what the other couldn't, and she found that the discipline was slightly harder to maintain than it had been this morning. She stood up. She collected the drafts of the letter. "I'm going to turn in," she said. "All right." He stood too, reflex of a man his mother had apparently raised with certain courtesies regardless of what else she had and hadn't given him. "Sleep well." "You too," she said. She went to the small room. She changed in the dark. She lay down. She stared at the ceiling for a while and did not entirely succeed in not thinking about what she was trying not to think about. The trip to Millhaven happened on a Wednesday, 12 days into November, and it was long and cold and better than she'd expected. They left before first light, the wagon loaded with empty crates and a list she'd spent 3 days refining. The road east ran through country that was different from the north road, higher and more open, with long views across dry grass to ridge lines that were white at the tops now. The first permanent snow of the season sitting up there with the permanence of something that had no plans to leave. She had not been east of Blackthorn Ridge in years. She'd had no reason to go. She sat on the wagon seat and looked at the landscape opening around her and felt something she didn't immediately identify, and then identified it as the specific pleasure of unfamiliar territory. Not the romantic version of that feeling, not adventure, but the quieter thing beneath adventure, which was simply the recognition that the world was larger than the space you'd been occupying. Colt drove without much talk for the first hour, which was his usual practice in mornings. She had stopped trying to fill the silence, which had taken some adjustment. She was not naturally a silent person, though years of being in situations where speaking tended to make things worse had trained her in the direction of quiet. She was learning to distinguish his silences. There was the silence of a man still waking up, which was the morning silence. There was the silence of a man thinking about a specific problem, which had a particular quality of directed attention that you could almost see. And there was the silence of a man who was comfortable, which was looser, which had more air in it, which didn't have the weight of something being processed. This morning silence was the comfortable kind. "Tell me about Millhaven," she said, when the sun had cleared the ridge and the cold had moved from sharp into merely cold. "Small," he said. "Bigger than Blackthorn Ridge, but not by much. They have a real doctor, 2 restaurants. The seed merchant's on the south end of the main street. Abelard, his name is. He knows his stock. He'll try to sell you more than you need, but only if you let him talk for too long." "How do you stop him?" "Ask him a technical question. He'll go find an answer, and by the time he's back, he's forgotten what he was selling you." She almost smiled. "You've done this before." "Once, 4 years ago. He sold me 100 pounds of winter wheat seed I couldn't use." He paused. "The question I asked was about soil pH. He was gone 20 minutes. "What did you do with the wheat seed?" "Left it in the barn. The mice got most of it." A brief pause. "So, technical questions." "I have many technical questions," she said. "I know you do." Millhaven sat in a valley where 2 creeks met, and it had the slightly more confident look of a town that had decided to stay. The buildings were taller, the main street wider, the general air less provisional. There were people on the street who didn't look at the arriving wagon with the focused curiosity of a small town where everyone's business was everyone else's business. Or at least, they looked and then looked away again at a normal human pace, without the lingering examination she'd grown up under. She noticed this. She noticed the absence of it, the breathing room in it. They went to the seed merchant first because she wanted the conversation with Abelard while her attention was fresh. He was a round man in his 50s with an impressive mustache and the warmth of someone who genuinely loved seeds as a subject and was only intermittently aware that other people loved them less. She let him talk for exactly 4 minutes, which she assessed as sufficient, and then she asked him about germination rates in high clay soil below 6,000 feet elevation, which sent him into the back of his shop for 17 minutes while she and Colt worked through the seed order at a table near the window with the price list he'd left with them and the list she'd brought from the ranch. When Abelard returned with a pamphlet and a great deal of information about clay soil, she thanked him, incorporated the relevant detail into the revised order, and concluded the transaction in 11 minutes. She spent $32.40 of the ranch money, which was $12 less than the upper limit she'd set. Outside, Colt looked at her. 17 minutes, he said. He needed 17. You only needed 20. I must have asked a simpler question. They ate at one of the restaurants, which served a beef stew that was better than functional and a bread that was genuinely good. And she noted the herb combination in the bread because it was something she could replicate if she could find the right seeds, which she had just ensured she could. They walked the length of the main street after, because she wanted to see what was there, and because Colt said there was a hardware supplier at the far end who sometimes had items the Blackthorn Ridge store didn't stock. At the hardware store, she found a pattern book for coats and wool work that she hadn't expected and spent 20 minutes going through it while Colt talked to the proprietor about wire gauges. She found the coat pattern she'd been trying to reconstruct from memory, plus 2 others she hadn't known she needed until she saw them. She brought them to the counter. "Getting into tailoring?" the proprietor asked, not unkindly. "I have a coat to make," she said, "and I hate doing things from memory when there's a better option." Colt appeared at her elbow. He looked at the pattern book. "That for the blue wool?" "Yes." He paid for it before she could, which surprised her, and which she chose not to make an issue of, though she logged it internally as something that required a conversation about household accounts that she hadn't drafted yet. The inn was at the north end of town, 2 rooms. She had wondered, briefly, on the journey here, how that would be arranged, and she had arranged it in her own mind with the pragmatism she tried to apply to things that had practical solutions. 2 people, 2 rooms. It was not complicated. Colt arranged it with the innkeeper without any apparent awareness that it was something that could be complicated. 2 rooms. He paid for both because the inn's account was not the ranch account, and she let this one go as well, making a second note in her internal ledger of conversations to have about money. Her room was small and clean with a window looking out over the creek. She washed her face and sat on the bed and listened to the different sounds of a different place, the creek, which was livelier than the one on the ranch, and street sounds that were slightly busier than Blackthorn Ridge and slightly less fraught. She heard Colt in the room next door. The ordinary sounds of a person settling in, boots coming off, the creak of a chair. Then quiet. She changed into her night things. She looked out the window at the creek in the dark and thought about the seeds they'd ordered and the letter to the county assessor and the pattern book on the bed beside her. She thought about that's the whole point of two people. She was not, she told herself firmly, a person who built castles on 10 weeks of proximity and shared meals in the absence of cruelty. She was not 18. She understood that kindness was not love, and respect was not love, and being useful to each other was not love. She understood all of this clearly and had been understanding it clearly for 10 weeks and was continuing to understand it. She picked up the pattern book. She was asleep 20 minutes later, the book open on her chest, the creak audible through the window, doing what she had been practicing, letting herself rest. They drove back to the ranch the next morning in weather that had turned properly cold. The sky a flat white that promised snow before the week was out. She had bought 2 more yards of the dark blue wool at a fabric shop she'd found near the inn, slightly heavier than the bolt at Marsh's store, better suited to the coat pattern. She had also found, at the same shop, a length of wool in a deep charcoal gray that she'd been looking at for 10 minutes before she made the decision that surprised her. She'd bought enough for a shirt, a man's shirt. She had taken the measurement she needed without discussing it. She was good at estimating from observation, and she'd been in proximity to the relevant reference material for 10 weeks. And she had bought the fabric and put it in the bag with the pattern book and said nothing about it. She was not sure what she was doing, or rather, she knew what she was doing, and she was choosing not to examine it too closely until she'd thought it through more carefully, because the gap between making someone a shirt because winter was coming and he only had 2 and both had seen better days, and making someone a shirt because you wanted to was a gap that she would need to navigate with some precision. On the wagon, in the cold, with the flat white sky pressing down on the dry grass hills around them, she turned up her collar and kept her hands in her lap and thought about the gap. Colt drove. He drove the same way he always did, settled, unhurried, the reins held with the easy authority of 11 years. He had barely spoken since they left the inn. Morning silence. She didn't try to fill it. They were 2 miles from the ranch, coming around the last curve of the north road, when he said, "You did well yesterday." She looked at him. In what sense? Abelard, the hardware store, the fabric shop. He was looking at the road. You know how to move through a place, how to get what you came for. She considered this. I've always been better in places where people don't know me. He was quiet for a moment. That's true of a lot of people. Is it true of you? I'm not good in places full of people, knowing me or not. He paused. I'm better one person at a time. You were fine in Millhaven. I was fine because you were doing most of the navigating and I was... He stopped. I was there in case anything needed carrying. She looked at the side of his face. He had said it without self-deprecation, without the slight bitterness that men sometimes put into statements about their own limitations. He had said it the way he said things that were simply true and did not require decoration. You did more than that, she said. Some. He turned the team into the ranch track. The house appeared at the top of the slope, the low, wide shape of it, the barn behind, the windmill still turning in the rising wind. But you didn't need rescuing. I never need rescuing, she said, before she'd thought about whether she wanted to say it. He pulled the team to a stop in the yard. He looked at her. I know that, he said. I knew that from selection day. She held his gaze for a moment. The wind moved between them, cold and indifferent. Then why did you choose me? She said. She had not intended to ask. She had been not asking it for 10 weeks with some success, and apparently today was the day her discipline in that particular area decided to lapse. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, because you were the only one standing there who looked like she was staying upright by decision rather than expectation. She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at the house. We should get the seeds in before it snows, she said. Yes, he said. He climbed down. She climbed down on her own side. They unloaded the wagon in the rising cold, carrying the seed crates into the barn where they'd stay dry, the fabric bags into the house. He saw to the horses. She put on the coffee. She was standing at the stove when he came in, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the first snow of November was beginning to fall. Not heavily, just the first tentative flakes, feeling out the air. She poured his coffee. She set it on the table. She went back to the stove and stood with her own cup and watched the snow come down through the window. Behind her, she heard him sit. She heard him open the document box. She heard the small sound of him picking up a pen. "Mara," he said. She turned. He was not looking at the document box. He was looking at her, with the full weight of that complete attention, the kind that didn't leave room for anything else. "I would choose you again," he said. "That's the answer to the question you didn't ask, or the one underneath the one you did." She stood at the stove with her coffee and looked at him across the kitchen. The snow came down outside. She said, "I know." And she did. She had known it for a while, in the way you know things that you've been carefully not looking at directly. You know the shape of them from the peripheral vision, the shadow they cast, the way everything around them arranges itself in relation to them. She turned back to the window. She allowed herself, quietly and without announcement, to want it. That was new? That was something she had not done in a very long time, and she did it carefully, like relearning a physical skill that had been unused for years, with the awareness that it would take practice, that the early attempts would be imperfect, and that imperfect was all right. The snow kept coming. The kitchen was warm. She stood at the window and let herself want what was already, in its slow and undemonstrative way, becoming hers. The snow that had started falling on the evening they returned from Millhaven did not stop for 2 days. It was not a violent storm. No wind to speak of, no drifting that blocked the barn doors or buried the fence line. Just steady, patient snowfall, the kind that accumulates without drama and leaves the world looking when it finally stops, like something that had always meant to be that way. The ranch disappeared inside it gradually, the kitchen garden becoming a series of low white shapes, the corral fence a line of caps, the hills beyond the north pasture softening into something almost gentle. Mara used the 2 days to cut the charcoal wool. She worked at the kitchen table, the pattern pieces she'd drafted from the book pinned to the fabric with the straight pins she'd bought in Millhaven, a pair of good shears moving through the material with the focused deliberateness of someone who understood that you only got one chance at a cut. She had not told Colt what she was making. He was in and out of the kitchen, checking the horses, splitting wood for the stove, the various small weathers of ranch maintenance that indoor weather created, and he looked at the fabric on the table without asking, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He did not ask about things that were in progress. He waited until they were finished. She finished the shirt on the 3rd day, when the snow had stopped, and the world outside had gone that particular silent white that made sound travel differently, made the windmills turning carry further than usual. She held it up in the kitchen light. It was not a perfect shirt. The collar sat slightly higher on the left than the right. She'd miscalculated the seam allowance on one side by 1/8 of an inch, which was the kind of error you saw when you were looking for it and didn't when you weren't. The buttons were dark horn, which she'd found in her sewing kit and which worked against the charcoal better than any alternative she'd had available. She folded it. She set it on the table. She went out to the barn where Colt was doing something to the harness he'd been meaning to fix since October, and she said, "There's something on the kitchen table for you." He looked up from the harness. "For me?" "Yes." He came in with her. He stood at the table and looked at the folded shirt for a moment, and then he picked it up and shook it out and held it at arm's length. He looked at her. "You made this," he said. "The wool's from Millhaven. The buttons are from my kit." She kept her voice practical, because if she let it be anything else, she would not be able to continue the conversation without embarrassing herself. "Your other 2 shirts are past reasonable repair. This should last longer if you don't use it for fence work." He held the shirt for another moment. He looked at the collar, at the buttons, at the seam along the shoulder. "The collar's not quite even," she said, before he could find it himself. "I can see that," he said. He looked at her. "I don't care about the collar." "I care about the collar," she said. "I'll fix it." "Don't fix it." He was still looking at her with the full weight of his attention, and she was working hard at maintaining her practical register, which was becoming more difficult by the moment. "Leave it." She looked at him. "It bothers me." "The collar bothers you," he said, "and you still gave it to me." She did not immediately have an answer to that. It was the kind of observation that came at you from a sideways angle and required a moment to process. "Try it on," she said. "I want to see if the shoulders are right." He put on the shirt. The shoulders were right. She had known they would be. She had been looking at those shoulders for 12 weeks, and she had a good eye for measurement. The length was correct. The sleeves were correct. The collar was still slightly uneven. She looked at it. She reached up, without thinking about the reaching up, and adjusted the left side with her fingers, aligning it. She was very close to him in the kitchen to do this, which she had also not thought about until she was already doing it. And when she looked up from the collar to check the alignment, she found that he was looking at her from a distance of approximately 8 inches with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the shadow of a smile. The full thing. She stepped back. "It's better," she said. "Yes," he said. He was still smiling, a little. She went to the stove and put on the coffee and did not say anything else for a minute. And he did not say anything either, but the kitchen had a different quality than it had had before she'd gone to the barn to get him, and she did not think the shirt alone was responsible for all of it. The letter to the county assessor went out in the second week of November, carried by the mail rider who came through twice a week on the road between Blackthorn Ridge and Millhaven. She had made a copy in her own hand and filed it in the document box under a new category: Webb, East Creek Boundary. She had also written, on a separate card, the dates and contents of every conversation involving Webb since she'd arrived at the ranch. Harlan Webb, at the corral gate. Hargrove in the yard. The exchange in the street. She filed the card with the letter. Colt looked at the card when she put it in the box. "You've been keeping records," he said, "since the beginning." She closed the box. "If it goes to arbitration, everything that shows a pattern of pressure will be relevant." "You were thinking about arbitration in October." "I was thinking about it before we got back from the first town trip." She looked at him. "Men like Webb don't have a single approach. They have a sequence. I wanted to have documentation ready for whichever approach he landed on." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the closed document box. "I've been ranching out here for 11 years, he said, "and it took me until 6 weeks ago to have a document box that I could find anything in." "You found things. It just took longer." "That's a charitable reading. It's an accurate one." She sat at the table. "You built everything here, the physical structure of it, the barn, the fences, the pasture rotation, the cattle program. You did that alone and you did it correctly. The organizational infrastructure was always going to be the second phase." "The second phase," he repeated. "You can't do everything at once. You do what the season requires." She looked at him. "That's what you told me about the north pasture rotation." He sat across from her. He had the expression of a man hearing his own logic return to him from an unexpected direction. "I did say that," he said. "You say useful things," she said. "You just say them about cattle when they apply more broadly." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "What's the third phase?" She hadn't thought about a third phase explicitly, but she found, when she examined her own thinking, that she had been doing so implicitly. "Expansion," she said. "The south-facing slope for the garden. Possibly a second horse for riding rather than work. In 3 years, if the cattle accounts hold, you could add to the herd without taking on debt." "We could," he said. She looked at him. "We could," she said. The words sat between them with the weight of something that had been there for a while, moving underground, and had just now come to the surface. December arrived, and with it, the particular quality of winter that Mara had not experienced before. Not the winter of a small room above a store in town, where cold was managed by proximity and coal stoves and the heat generated by 200 bodies living in close quarters. But the winter of a place with open sky on 4 sides, where cold was a landscape condition rather than a nuisance. The stars were extraordinary. She had not expected the stars. She had grown up looking at a narrow strip of sky between the roof lines of Blackthorn Ridge, and she had thought she knew what stars looked like. She did not know what stars looked like. Out here, without the interference of lamplight from close buildings, the sky on a clear winter night was something you needed a moment to absorb. She stood in the yard one evening after supper and looked at it until her neck ached, and she could no longer feel her fingers. Colt found her there. He came out with her coat. She had left it on the hook inside, and handed it to her without comment. She took it. He stood beside her and looked at the sky. "You get used to it," he said, "and then you stop seeing it, and then something reminds you and you see it again." "What reminded you this time?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Watching you look at it." She put on her coat. She looked at the stars. There were things they had not said to each other directly. There were things she thought they both understood without the saying, and things she was less sure about, and things she was actively uncertain about in herself. She had been thinking about Webb's water and the arbitration date, and the spring garden plan, and the second horse, and the third phase. And inside all of that practical thinking, she had also been thinking about what it meant to be building a future in a particular place with a particular person, and whether the building was the same thing as choosing, and whether she had been choosing without noticing she was doing it, or whether she had noticed and simply not announced it. She thought she had noticed. She thought she had been choosing for some time. "I want to go back to Blackthorn Ridge," she said. He looked at her. "When?" "Before the end of the year, before Selection Day comes around again and someone else takes my place in that square." She paused. Not the square of Selection Day, She did not mean she needed to witness it. She meant something different, something harder to articulate. "I want to walk through that town as the person I am now. Not slip through it doing errands and leaving, walk through it." He was quiet. "Webb will be there," he said. "Strand, Hargrove." "I know." "The people who laughed." "I know." She looked at the stars. "That's not why. I'm not going back for them. I'm going back for—" She tried to find the right words, which was harder with Colt than with most people because he had the unsettling quality of actually listening to what she said rather than waiting for her to finish. "I've been leaving that town in my head since I was 12 years old, imagining what it would feel like to just not be defined by it anymore. Not to be Scarface, or the woman no one wanted, or the embarrassment. And when I actually left on the wagon with you, I was so focused on surviving the leaving that I didn't—" She stopped. "I didn't finish it." He was looking at her. "All right," he said. "All right? We'll go." He looked back at the sky. "When?" "Saturday," she said. "There's a community gathering, the end of year one. Everyone goes." "Everyone," he said. "Yes." A pause. "That's a lot of people." "I know. I'm not asking you to—" She stopped. "I'm asking you to be there, that's all. You don't have to say anything or do anything." He looked at her with the kind of directness she had come to associate with him saying something he had considered and decided. "I'll be there," he said. "And I might say something." She looked at him. "I'll say whatever I think needs saying," he said. She thought about arguing. She decided against it. He had 11 years of withheld speech stored somewhere, and she thought that whatever came out of it would probably land correctly. "All right," she said. They stood in the yard until the cold drove them in. She made coffee. He stoked the stove. The stars continued their business overhead, indifferent and magnificent. The end-of-year gathering happened in the meeting hall that doubled as Blackthorn Ridge's school. It was the largest social event of the town's calendar. Not because anyone was required to attend, but because winter had settled in and people were restless, and the hall was warm, and there was music and food brought by various households, and the particular social release of a community that had been keeping close to home for several weeks. Mara wore the blue coat she had finished the previous week. She had gotten the collar right on this one, had been obsessive about the collar, had redone the left side twice before she was satisfied. The coat was well made. She knew it was well made because she had made it with the focused attention she gave to things that needed to be right. It was the dark blue of a winter sky in the late afternoon, and it fit her correctly, which was not a standard she had ever previously met in anything she wore, because she had always altered other people's patterns to fit a body that other people hadn't designed for. Colt wore the charcoal shirt. She noticed him noticing her noticing it, and they said nothing about it, and they drove to town. They arrived at the hall at 7:30, which was late enough that the gathering was well underway, but not so late as to make an entrance of the arriving. She had calculated this. She was aware that she was calculating it and did not find that this diminished anything. Preparation was not the enemy of authentic experience. It was what made authentic experience survivable. The hall was warm and loud. Someone had strung paper decorations from the rafters. 3 musicians in the corner were working through a reel with varying degrees of success. Tables along the wall held dishes that represented the cooking of approximately 30 households, which was to say, everything from excellent to ambitious. She felt the moment they were seen. Not one moment. A series of small moments, the way a wave passes through water rather than arriving all at once. Someone near the door, whose name she didn't remember, going still for a second. Clara Briggs, now Clara Eddard, looking up from across the room and then looking at her husband. Mrs. Hensley, who was near the food table and who saw Mara and whose whole face did something complicated and warm. She felt Colt beside her, not touching, just there. She went to Mrs. Hensley first. The old woman took her hands, both of them, without asking, and looked at her with the expression of someone conducting a rapid assessment of the evidence. "You look well," she said. "I am well," Mara said. "The coat." Mrs. Hensley looked at it. "You made this." "I did." "The shoulders are right." She said it with the authority of a woman who had spent 40 years looking at the quality of other people's sewing. "The lining, too. Cotton flannel. I ordered it from Millhaven." Mrs. Hensley looked at Colt. She gave him the same rapid assessment. "You're feeding her," she said. "We feed each other," Colt said. Mrs. Hensley looked at Mara. Something decided in her expression. "Good," she said, and went back to the food table. They moved through the hall. People spoke to them, some with the effortful warmth of people trying to demonstrate that they had not previously been unkind, which was its own kind of information. Some with ordinary social interaction that required nothing to be demonstrated or corrected. Clara Eddard came over and spoke to Mara for 10 minutes about the school in Millhaven, which Mara had written to about a teaching position, a detail that Clara seemed to have heard about through the particular information network of small-town women, which moved faster than any mail service. Her husband stood nearby and shook Colt's hand, and they talked about cattle prices with the relieved directness of men who had found a topic that required no navigation. Strand was there. He was in the corner near the musicians, and he looked at her once across the room and then looked away. And she looked at him for exactly as long as it took to register his presence and then looked at something else. He did not come over. She had not expected him to. Webb was not there. She had thought he might be and had prepared herself, but his absence was not surprising either. Webb's social calculus was sophisticated enough to tell him that a direct confrontation in a public setting, after the letter to the county assessor, would not serve him. Hargrove was there. He came to them about an hour in, with the careful approach of a man who had rehearsed his opening. He addressed them both, which was different from how he'd addressed them in the yard of the ranch. He said that he hoped they were settling in well, and that the property business would resolve itself in a way that suited everyone. Mara said that she was sure the arbitration process would produce an appropriate outcome. He said he hoped it wouldn't come to that. She said so did she, which was true, and which contained the same information it had always contained without needing to be said again. He moved on. She watched him go. "That was it?" Colt said quietly beside her. "That was it," she said. "He's repositioning. He'll stay neutral going forward. Because of the letter. Because of the letter and because of today. He's seen how things are now." She watched Hargrove greet another group across the room with his usual forward-leaning authority. "He's a practical man. He backed the wrong approach with Webb, and he knows it. He'll find a way to be right about something else, and that'll be the version of events he tells himself." "Does that bother you?" Colt asked. She thought about it. "No," she said. "I'm not interested in his version of events. I'm interested in the outcome." The musicians moved into a slower piece, something with a fiddle leading that had a long, open quality to it. A few couples moved to the cleared space at the center of the hall. She watched them, Clara and her husband, 2 other couples she recognized, a third she didn't. She became aware of something happening in her chest. A pressure, not anxiety. She had learned to distinguish the two, but something that had more forward motion in it. Something building. She had told Colt she wanted to come here and walk through this town as the person she was now. She had said it, and she had meant it, and she had done it. She had walked in, she had spoken to people, she had been looked at without bracing, and had looked back without flinching, and had said the right things in the right register, and had worn her own coat that she had made herself, and it had fit correctly, and she had been, by the standards of this gathering, unremarkable. Unremarkable. The word landed with more weight than she'd expected. She had spent so much of her life being the wrong kind of remarkable that unremarkable, until this moment, had felt like the destination. Like what she was working toward. The ability to move through a room without the room making her into something. But standing in the hall with the fiddle going and the paper decorations moving slightly in the warm air, she found that unremarkable wasn't quite right. It wasn't what she'd actually wanted. It was what she'd wanted when wanting was dangerous. It was the small version of the wanting. She turned to Colt. "I want to dance," she said. He looked at her. She said it again, more carefully. "I want to dance in this room, in front of these people. Not because I'm good at it. I haven't danced since I was 16 years old, and even then I wasn't—" She stopped, breathed. "Ida Rourke told everyone I danced like a fence post in a windstorm. At the winter gathering, 8 years ago, and I stopped. I've never danced since." She looked at the couples moving in the center of the room. "I want to." He was very still beside her. "Then we will," he said. "You can dance?" "Badly," he said. "My mother taught me enough to get through a room without causing injury." "That's all I need," she said. He held out his hand, the same way he'd held out his arm in the square on selection day, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the plain offer of a thing that was available. She took it. They moved to the center of the room. She was aware of the looking, the shift in attention that happened when two people moved into a shared space in a room that had been watching them all evening. She felt it the way she had always felt it, in the specific exposed place between her shoulder blades where other people's attention had always landed first. She felt it, and she did not stop moving. Colt put his hand at her back, and they found the rhythm of the fiddle, and they danced. It was not graceful. He had not been lying about the badness. He moved through the steps with the careful deliberateness of a man counting internally, and she moved with the stiffness of someone whose body remembered being laughed at and had never entirely released that memory. They were not the best dancers in the room. They were probably among the worst. They kept going, and something happened that she had not planned for and could not have predicted. Somewhere in the third minute of the dance, in the space between one step and the next, she stopped thinking about being watched. It did not happen because she decided to stop. It happened the way sleep happens, not by trying, but by the gradual release of the effort not to. She felt his hand at her back and the floor under her feet and the music going, and she was simply in it. In the plain physical fact of moving with another person to music in a warm room in winter. She was not a fence post in a windstorm. She was a woman who had not danced in 8 years, dancing badly and without apology in front of everyone who had defined her for most of her life. Around them she became aware, gradually, without searching for it, of a change in the room, not applause, nothing so theatrical, just the specific quality of attention that shifts when something moves from spectacle to something else. When the watching moves from waiting for failure to something that has no name in the vocabulary of cruelty. She did not look at anyone else. She kept her eyes at the level of Colt's shoulder, which was approximately where they fell naturally, given the difference in height, and she danced. When the fiddle finished its piece and the musicians paused, she and Colt stopped. She was breathing slightly faster than usual. He was too. They stood in the middle of the cleared floor, and around them people began to talk again, to move, to continue the 100 ordinary things that a gathering contains. Ida Rourke was 6 feet away. Mara had not known she was there until this moment. Ida was 40 now, with the look of a woman who had stayed exactly where she'd always been and had organized her sense of self around the navigation of that particular territory. She was looking at Mara with an expression that was working through several things. Mara looked back at her. She was not angry. She had expected to feel anger, or the complicated relative of it that she'd been carrying for years, and she found instead that she felt not forgiveness exactly, which had always seemed like a transaction that required both parties to acknowledge the original debt, but something quieter, a putting down. The way you put down a heavy bag when you realize you've been carrying it longer than necessary. "Ida," she said. Ida opened her mouth and closed it. "It's a good gathering," Mara said, simply. The way she said things that were true and required no weight added to them. She turned back to Colt. He was looking at her with that complete attention, and in it she could see that he had understood what had just happened. Not the dance, the other thing, the thing underneath the dance, and was acknowledging it without making an event of it. "You want food?" he said. "Yes," she said. They went to the food table. They drove home under stars. The road north unrolled ahead of them in the wagon's lantern light, pale with packed snow, the creek audible on the left through the frozen cottonwoods. The cold had depth to it at this hour, a December cold that meant business, But the blanket she'd brought was adequate, and they were close enough on the seat that warmth was shared without remark. She was tired. Not the depleted tired of a day that had cost her. The satisfied tired of a day that had required everything and had been equal to the requirement. "You did it," he said after a while. "We did it," she said. "I mostly stood there." "You danced badly." "Yes." "That was enough." She looked at the road ahead. "That was exactly what I needed." He was quiet. The horses moved at their steady pace. The lantern swayed. "What Ida Rourke said," he began. "It's done," she said. "I'm not carrying it anymore." He looked at her. Just like that. Not just like that. She had been thinking about this on the drive, how to say it correctly, which was important because she only said important things once, if she could help it. "I've been putting it down in pieces since October. Every morning I woke up at the ranch and the day required something of me and I did it. Every time I got on Della and didn't fall off. Every column in the ledger that balanced. Every conversation I had that wasn't about surviving being looked at." She watched the lantern light move over the snow. Tonight was just the last piece, the one I'd been saving. He drove without speaking. "And Webb," he said eventually. "Webb will go to arbitration and lose," she said. Not dramatically. Not in a way that embarrasses him publicly, because the arbitrator will be a county man who doesn't want to make enemies in this valley. But the record is clear, and the petition has no foundation, and by March the whole thing will be filed and settled, and he'll move on to some other approach to some other problem. She paused. "He's not going to stop being who he is. He'll be back eventually, but we'll be here when he is." We. The word had become ordinary. She was not sure when that had happened. "We'll be here," Colt said. The ranch came into view at the top of the north slope, the low shape of the house in the dark, the barn behind it, the windmill catching the starlight on its blades. She looked at it the way she had looked at it on the first day, when she'd stood in the yard and identified the feeling as the absence of dread. The feeling was different now. Not the absence of something, the presence of it. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. She climbed down on her own side. He saw to the horses. She heard him talking to them quietly in the barn, the low, one-sided conversation he had with the animals that he never had in front of people, which she had discovered by accident one morning and had never mentioned because it seemed like something that deserved to remain private. She went into the kitchen and put on the coffee and sat at the table. She put her hands flat on the surface of it. The table where she had opened the first ledger, 12 weeks ago, with the deliberate calm of a woman doing the one thing available to her. The table where he had told her the books were a mess, and she had told him she could see that. The table where they had eaten supper every night since, and the slow accumulation of shared ordinary hours that turned out to be what a life was made of, more than any single moment. She thought about what it meant in the end. Not just her story, though it was her story, and she was clear on that now in a way she hadn't always been, but the thing inside the story, the thing that was worth passing along. You cannot wait to become someone before you take up space. She had spent 24 years believing, somewhere beneath all her practicality, that the life she wanted was something that would happen after she became more acceptable, more beautiful, more whatever it was the world wanted from a woman who looked like her. She had been practical about everything else, and magical in her thinking about this one thing, that transformation was the prerequisite for belonging. It was not. You took up space first. You made the fire. You reorganized the shelves. You got on the horse, even though you'd never done it before, and you fell off and you got back on. You said the true thing to the man in the store who thought you wouldn't. You wrote the letter. You asked the questions you'd been not asking because asking felt like wanting too much. You danced badly in front of everyone, and the belonging came from the doing of it, not from becoming someone worthy of it first. You were already worthy. You had always been worthy. The trick was acting as if that were true, until the acting became indistinguishable from believing it. She did not think of herself as someone who had learned this through suffering in a way that made the suffering noble. She had not suffered beautifully. She had suffered badly, with anger and sometimes bitterness, and sometimes the particular exhaustion of a person who has been managing other people's discomfort with their existence for so long they've forgotten what it feels like to just exist. But she had gotten here, not to a perfect place. The collar on Colt's shirt was still slightly uneven, and she still intended to fix it. The web matter would resolve in March and would probably be followed by something else, because that was the nature of things that had been built in difficult terrain. The ranch would demand things they hadn't anticipated. She would make errors in the accounts occasionally and catch them, as she always did. Spring would be harder than she'd planned and better than she'd feared, as most things were. But here, in a kitchen that was hers, at a table that was theirs, the door opened and Colt came in from the barn. He hung his coat. He looked at her at the table. "Coffee's ready," she said. He poured 2 cups. He sat across from her. He set her cup beside her, as he had done every morning since the first one, and he looked at her with the quiet directness that she had learned was the fullest expression of him. Not the almost smile, not the silence, but the look that meant he was where he intended to be. "Good night," he said. It was not a question. It was the way he named a thing that was true. "Yes," she said. It was. She drank her coffee. Outside, the stars continued their ancient, indifferent turning. The windmill moved. The horses were quiet in the barn. The snow on the hills to the north held the light in the way snow does, not reflecting so much as remembering it, keeping it past the point when everything else had gone dark. She was not the unwanted woman of Blackthorn Ridge. She was not a joke or a cautionary tale or someone's example of what happened if you set your expectations wrong. She was Mara Whitlock, who kept excellent accounts and rode a horse named Della and made coats that fit correctly, and had walked into a room full of people who had once defined her and had danced in front of all of them and had come home after. She was Mara Mercer, who had a document box with a spring folder and a letter filed under Webb, East Creek boundary, and a kitchen garden plan for a south-facing slope below the barn. She was a woman who had stopped waiting for permission to take up space and had taken it, imperfectly and with difficulty and at a cost she would not minimize, and had found on the other side of the taking not a transformed self, but simply herself. The same person she had always been, finally in a place that let her be it. That was the whole of it. That was enough. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup. She said goodnight to the man across the table, who said goodnight back in the plain, 2-word way he said things that mattered most. She went to her room. She slept without difficulty. She did not dream of Blackthorn Ridge.